Hello, and welcome to PolitFlix on Movie Viral. I've lost count at this stage of which episode it is, but as I said last time, or the time before that. E-
Have you done any since our last episode?
have I? No.
That was 12. That was
Right.
12. So
So
you
this is
haven't.
the.
This is 13.
This is. Well, we'll call it 12.5. We don't want to be unlucky. We don't want to tempt fate. Even James Bond is
Okay.
superstitious, isn't he? I suppose. You know, in.
He is with that knife.
Yes, Her Majesty's
Yeah, no,
Secret
it's a
Service.
knife in Majesty's. Throws it at the 14th instead.
Yes, even though he shouldn't be with life like his. So it's me and Dave Bond. Hello, Dave. How are you?
Yeah. Good evening, folks. Hi, James.
Now, the theme of this one is it's difficult to pin down. It's biopics and it's Oliver Stone, but it's also very much about, I think, the murky nature of characters in politics that and in those who make history, that it's never quite a black and white good versus evil struggle as we get in many of the other franchises. But at the same time, there is a sense of that filmic creativity. The overlap with the current climate, I suppose, is that there's both a continuity and a contrast in the sense that, on the one hand, movies are becoming quite a lot more simple in the sense of going back to that childhood sense of good versus evil with the franchises that we watch and so on. But even those tend to diversify by a second episode or a sequel that goes slightly dark or into Shades of Grey. Not that Shades of Grey franchise, but if we look even at something like Star Wars, there are elements of that, and there are overlaps. So we're dealing with, we have JFK, Nixon, we have Snowden,
W.
and we have W.
W first.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And all of those, in their way, if you look at them, just prima facie, they're all biopics, but they're not just biopics, because what Oliver Stone does quite cleverly, I think, but we'll get to it, is he experiments with different genres within the frame of what we might call a biopic. So there are certain bits that are comedy, certain bits that are thriller, and a sense perhaps of conspiracy tapestries that might be behind the scenes, either implicitly or explicitly. But we'll get to it. Now, speaking of that, politically, obviously, we're building up to Christmas, so things, by their very nature, slow down a bit. There is some sort of progress on Brexit, but it's so complex and such a tired web by this stage that I think even both passionate Remainers and passionate Brexiteers are now so bored of the whole bloody thing. Get on with it! It's kind of... I don't know where to begin. It's just... I can't... You can't dumb it down. You can't simplify it without oversimplifying it. I feel...
But the whole thing is a dumbed down process anyway, James.
Yeah.
It's certainly in public consciousness, because this isn't. Well, I don't hide for a moment. I'm a Remainer, and I am not for a second going to call Brexiters, simple or anything like that. I simply no. That's not what's implied by what I'm about to say.
Oh, you didn't
But the
mean
question
simple
was
in
put
sort of
so
Alan Partridge. I think he's about simple.
No, I did mean in that sense. I think that is the natural outcome people will take away from what I'm about to say, and I don't really mean it like this. I just think the question was put too simply to be a referendum. I just think it's a complicated issue of relationship with the European Union, and to say in or out with no idea where that's going, it's kind of speaks to quite a dumbed down process anyway. But that would hold true for those that voted to stay in, for those that came out. There was no sense of a real discussion about future relationship with that body, or any real talk of what we do and don't get from it, or anything like that. But I find that that's carried into the whole Brexit process now. That is all it is one long charade of public relations on both sides. That's all it is. The government needs to be saying they're achieving something, and Europe need to say they're achieving something, and they're also being sort of reasonably tough with us as well. And they go in front of cameras together and give very mixed messages. I think for a period of time, they were saying they were getting nowhere, and Europe was saying we had no idea what we wanted, and we wanted to leave and keep everything we had, and all of that. And then there was definitely a period, and I think we're still in that period, where the messages coming out from both sides have been a little bit more conciliatory. But evidence in any way that things are necessarily going better. I just think it came to a point where the message almost changed overnight, and I think that they've had a word behind the scenes and just said, we can't carry on like this. We've got to paint a better spin on all of this and how we talk to each other. We're just drumming up dissent. So that's a long way round to saying that the whole Brexit process now, you can't really believe anything you're hearing. Not really, because there's two sides having to spin their agenda. And it was off the back of a process that was presented to the public in a very, very simple binary way anyway. So at no point, even if everyone who voted Brexit had the deepest possible understanding of all of the issues and what they wanted out of it, the fact is they were still asked, in or out, and we'll do what you tell us, which is just dumbed down to hell in the first place. So I've got no faith in this as a process that puts any faith or stock in the electorate at all, which makes it all the more laughable this question was ever asked of us.
Yeah, but there you have it. We're stuck with it.
We're stuck with it now. We're stuck with it, and the thing is, democracy is the least worst form of government.
Yeah.
So
when you consider the alternative,
we vote now.
As we will later on.
Yeah, we voted out.
Speaking of,
it's as simple as that.
Speaking
I
of
don't like
that,
it, but the constant bitching about it isn't actually helping.
It's not helping anybody, and it's particularly, it's like they want the so-called Irish question brought back. The stuff about this Irish border thing. I think even the Irish are saying, "Look, at this stage, we don't care." Well, they're not saying that, but I also keep calling the Taoiseach. The Taoiseach is the Irish leader. I keep calling him Ravi Shankar.
Thanks, James, I knew that.
Yes. I keep calling him Ravi Shankar for some reason. I know that's not his name, but he's a very wise man and he's very progressive. So I keep thinking Ravi Shankar, and I keep having visions of him addressing the nation with a sort of a namaste kind of caricatured cartoon in the background where he's telling everyone to just calm down about Brexit, be calm, and he gets the whole nation to sort of meditate. But to be honest, I think the Irish would survive no matter what. I think anyone who is deliberately trying to get headlines by talking about dangers to the peace process really needs to visit Ireland and realise quite how irrelevant a lot of that feeling is now 20 years on. I mean, for crying out loud, the Taoiseach of that country is an Indian gay man. Well, I mean, he's Indian by birth, so obviously an Irishman, but he's at least half Indian. He's a progressive, liberal, very young man. I think he's 38, if that. He might be 40. But what I'm saying is, if I'm saying anything at all, to paraphrase Stark, trying to turn Ireland into some sort of a drama, a crisis at this point is the worst kind of just inanity.
It's very easy to get caught up in what your side is saying as well, because as a Remainer, I don't think the question should have been asked, and that's not about not wanting democracy. It's fundamentally a representative democracy and far too complex question.
Yeah.
Particularly when we've had 20 years of the print press treating Europe as the bogeyman. So I'm not fond of the fact that we've got this process. It does piss me off, but at the same time, I'm having to kind of rein that in. And I'm aware that I'm self-selecting one side of the story.
Yeah.
Now, I don't think the other side of the story is particularly rosy. I really don't. But that very point you just made about Ireland is actually suggestive of the fact that it's very easy to stay inside your own side's bubble and go, oh, fuck, what about Ireland? Anyway, Brexit does piss me off. I'm sick of the word. I wish they'd come up with any fucking thing else. Because if I had a pound for every time I've heard that word, I'd be a very rich man by now.
A billionaire. You could buy Star Wars. You could buy Disney.
And I fucking well would.
Speaking of which,
okay.
Have you heard about? Of course, you've heard about it. Disney might be buying a large chunk of Fox's film-related assets. Now, it's interesting.
What we're talking about here is their film and television rights and library, effectively. So if you look at the things Fox own, and I'll forget loads of things, but in terms of product related to stuff Disney already have, they own a couple of the Marvel franchises in that Marvel don't own themselves. So they own the X-Men. So all of the sort of Hugh Jackman, Wolverine type stuff, Professor Xavier with, the current series with James McAvoy, Michael Fassbender, the original one with Patrick Stewart Stewart and Ian McKellen, they are all Fox owned. So anything X-Men related. The Fantastic Four, which Fox have never really got right, although I do think it's quite difficult to bring to the screen, but that's just me. That's owned by Fox as well. So there are two things that could come back. The other thing is they do own the domestic distribution rights for James Bond films. When you go and buy a James Bond Blu-ray, DVD, anything like that, you'll get the Fox logo at the start of the disc, not the start of the film. It's still an MGM/United Artists/ in recent times a Sony exercise, but although Sony is a distributor, but the home rights are owned by Fox, so they get more of their own sort of universe back. In terms of Marvel, they get what else? The Bond rights. What else do Fox own? Can you think of anything off the top of your head?
Not insignificantly, they own the television rights for Batman. Gotham, I think. Well, once again, I think it's complex because I think it's just distribution rather than actual copyright. But
you've sparked off a thought in me. It took them years to release Batman, the 60s television series. That came out in 2015. I know that because I got a job that year that ended up being a disaster. I hated it. But I bought myself that as a little bit of a present for getting that job. That was 2015, but for years only the 66 film was released, and that was to do to the complexities of the rights because DC Comics are owned by Time Warner, so Warner Brothers.
Yeah.
But Fox owned But my understanding is Fox owned the television rights, and they had to sort of come together to figure that out before they could release it because Fox obviously bought whatever. Was it NBC? I can't remember who made the 1960s TV series, to be quite honest with you, because Fox as a studio didn't exist then. But yeah, that gives them. I don't know really what that gives them though.
Gotham.
Batman isn't chiefly a television franchise though, is it? I know Gotham is on TV at the moment.
Yeah.
But Batman's worth to a company is not necessarily as a television franchise.
No.
Whereas I think, say Disney decided they wanted to buy Star Trek, I think they'd want to unite both sets of rights because Star Trek is important as a TV property. I'm not sure Batman is in the same way.
Yeah.
I might be wrong on that. I'm willing to be disagreed with. I don't feel that strongly about
Well, people are either, I think there are two camps. People are either oversimplifying it or they're overcomplicating it. I think it's pretty self-evident what Fox is doing, and what people are forgetting is that even if a deal isn't made with Disney, if, for example, Fox sell to...
A deal will be made.
Yeah, but
deal will be made if it's not this.
It will be handled. It is being handled. We are handling it. We handle everything. Thank you, as Trump would say. But there is a possibility, and it's tentative, and it could just be corporate cock teasing. We've got alternative offers, but Comcast, Universal have put in a bid as well, apparently. Now, in the unlikely event, highly unlikely, Dave, that Disney don't close this deal, even though they will, as you quite rightly point out, in any event... Yeah, but in any event, what would happen? Worst case scenario is that Universal make the deal, and it's a better deal. What would happen then is that even then, Fantastic Four and X-Men would still go to Disney and Marvel because they'd revert to Marvel, because those rights.
Hang on, are we sure about that?
Yes.
The licenses surely would go with them.
Because the licenses would simply expire. Universal would get, I think, certain distribution says, shall we say, in the same way as Universal have a distribution monopoly right over the Hulk, which is why we don't get a Hulk movie. But the making rights... Which
is absolute bollocks, because they've already made one, but anyway, go on.
They made two, but, just doesn't... He doesn't work.
No, sorry, no, they have made one, because I'm talking about under Marvel Studios.
The Incredible Hulk, yeah. But then, of course, Marvel Studios at that point... Yeah, but Marvel Studios at that point hadn't done its... Yeah, they hadn't done their Disney deal. And to be honest,
Yes, but Iron Man 3 was still distributed through Paramount.
Well,
yeah. After Disney bought it, they were honouring existing...
No, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And I think in the same way, or at least I hope, because whilst I'm happy enough for a Star Wars that doesn't have the 20th Century Fox logo, even though it took me ages to cope with that great trauma.
I still miss it.
And I don't want an Indiana Jones film to start without the Paramount mountain. I just don't. Spielberg has to find a way to do it under Disney, but still have the Paramount logo in joke, even though they really buggered that with the crystal skull turning into a prairie
It's
dog.
much harder to find like a hill or something, or a mountain in the distance in a scene that's the same shape. It's much easier to find one the shape of the Paramount logo than it is to find one the shape of the Disney castle.
Yeah, that never occurred. They could still, yeah.
I'm looking at their highest grossing films worldwide in North America, James, and a lot of them we've already mentioned. But if you look at what's franchisable, Avatar.
Yes.
Avatar is a Fox property. Now, with that, you're not just looking at films. That's got
Cartoon.
It probably needs a Disney to exploit it, because that film, for its size, has no cultural footprint. They own Fox own Planet of the Apes. That could be interesting.
Yeah, because this is why I have some minor reservations about Matt Reeves's much heralded Batman trilogy. Like he's the savior of Batman. Because okay, those first two Planet of the Apes movies that he did were amazing, but the third one was, I didn't even bother watching it.
No, Rupert Wyatt did the first
one. Oh, Rupert Wyatt did the first one. But that third, Matt Reeves did the third, the most recent Planet of the Apes one, right? And it didn't do amazing box office or anything. But theoretically, the bad thing about this obviously is that lots of people are raising questions about monopoly, about Disney owning everything, which is a fair question. But the fact of the matter is, if that were even an issue, at least in terms of actual law, this negotiation wouldn't even be at the stage that it's at. There are antitrust measures, and the fact of the matter is it's a specific division that Fox is welcome to sell to whoever they choose to sell it. The second thing is, you've got to admit that just as a fan who wants to see, literally, as a fan of the comic books that one saw as a kid, something like, I'll give you an example, I'm not sure whether you agree with me, and a lot of podcasters and so on will disagree with me, but Captain America Civil War as a graphic novel, before it was when it was just Marvel Civil War as a graphic novel, before it was the Captain America movie. One of the reasons it's so epic and brilliant and readable, either in serial format or as a graphic novel.
It would be fucking ludicrous on the big screen, but okay.
It would be ludicrous on the big screen, except, here's the thing. If it's this gigantic epic event, you have to have almost universal consequences. And the one criticism that I kind of do have of Captain America Civil War is that it's an excellent movie and it's an excellent thriller. And by bringing in Spider-Man, for example, they were able to widen the world a little bit.
I wasn't that in love with it, but we'll get there.
Yeah, but when it comes to that big epic confrontation in the airport, only about 5 people in it. So if you think about it,
that's a bit of an exaggeration.
Okay, but you know what I mean? Imagine that on a much more epic cosmic scale. And I think the other thing is it opens all other options for...
James, you're thinking of comic book panels.
Yeah.
You're thinking of artwork.
Yes.
The problem with, there is such a thing as less is more.
Right.
My problem with all of the team-up movies is they're spinning plates to get it to work every time.
Yeah.
My favourite films in that series tend to have been much more about one man. I wish I could say one woman as well, but they haven't done their major sort of female lead yet with Captain Marvel. But when I look at it, I thought Civil War was overstuffed. Now, I still thought they did a decent job.
Yeah.
But they're trying to balance what I consider to be ridiculous casts already. And that was without the Hulk there and others. And everyone's getting really minor screen time apart from the main sort of two, if you like, Tony and Steve. And I just think the idea of blowing that up to 5 or 6 times the number that they already did, because it looked epic and amazing in a series of comic book panels, is wrong-headed.
Yes.
I think it's already as big as it needs to be. If you bring on the X-Men and Fantastic Four as well, to throw it into this universe on top of this would be too much. Now, that's not to say they can't play in the same universe. That's not to suggest you don't reboot X-Men, Fantastic Four, go for a much more comic book loyal. I'm not a big X-Men fan. That's not to say I dislike it, but I don't know the comic books that well. But for example, the relationships between different characters is very different in the screen version in terms of who's related to who and so on. Now, if Marvel wanted to take it, redo all that, go for like a little scrappy Wolverine in the fullness of time and everything else, then I'm all right with that. And I've got no problem with it nominally being in the same universe as their current characters. but the X-Men kind of works as a world of its own anyway. And as much as I've got reservations about those films, Bryan Singer, for all his flaws as a director, and really he hasn't done anything amazing since The Usual Suspects, but he really did play on themes of alienation and being an outsider. Now, Bryan Singer is both gay. Let's get away from any of the sort of suggestions around him at the moment. But what we do know to be true about him is he's gay and he's adopted. So he grew up with feelings of alienation. And the X-Men's a wonderful allegory for that. You know, just being brought up different somehow.
Yeah.
And needing a refuge where you can be around other people that are like you. And I don't think throwing that straight in the middle of a Civil War type film does anything other than massively overstuff both universes.
Sure.
So I don't mind them being separate.
No.
But together. I.e., yes, by all means, reboot X-Men and have it in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But I wouldn't have them crossing over very much. I know the talk was to cross them over with the Fantastic Four, but I think that was basically because Fox owned both.
It was to try and salvage something from the mess that was becoming.
The Trank reboot was friggin' awful. It really was.
Yeah, they wanted something.
You know, they've got some products that do lend themselves very, very much to Disney. Avatar, I think, when you think of the theme park potential and all the rest of it, they own. I know it's an old aging franchise now, but Fox do own The Simpsons. Fox do own. I'm looking at the film title. They own Planet of the Apes, and I think that's got more potential to keep going. Obviously, it won't be Caesar's story anymore, but that can keep going. And obviously, as we've already mentioned, they do own two major strands of the Marvel universe.
Well, Caesar apparently was being a real diva on set. He was making all sorts of demands. He wanted a bigger tree. He wanted a tree connected to his trailer.
He wanted bigger tree?
Yeah. He wanted bigger tree. And he was a complete sexist pig. He was pinching the bums of all the secretaries on the set and then saying, if you say anything about this, no one's going to believe you because I'm an ape and everyone loves me and everyone knows I'm one of the good apes. And it's just disgusting what I've heard about him. So I don't think, if they do reboot it, I don't think they'll be using his services. He's just...
They won't be using him again, no.
And Caesar, you can't sue us because you're an ape.
That franchise can carry on, though.
He's a damn dirty ape.
We haven't got to anything. I mean, it wouldn't be exactly the same, but we haven't got to what this universe's version of the 1969 film yet. So there are more arcs and stories to be told. It felt like a natural end of Caesar's after 3, but I don't think Planet of the Apes is finished at all. So there's more that you can do with it there. So yeah, I mean, it's an interesting acquisition, and I've got mixed feelings over it, only from the perspective of. I don't have a problem with Disney owning any individual franchise, and for everyone bitching and whining about Star Wars and that, I've actually liked the new films so far. We can talk about the buzz around The Last Jedi in a minute.
Well, it's all positive. It's all positive. I've not seen one bad review.
I've seen one lukewarm, and it was Jeff Snyder. Jeff Snyder was lukewarm. Everyone else has been pretty ecstatic.
Who is that person?
Let's see what it's called. Jeff Snyder. I've just said his name 3 times.
But who is he? Or she? Or it?
I think he runs the tracking board, which is now Drew McQueenie's home. Think of writers from the last few years. I've heard the podcast as well. I'm trying to think who he's podcast with. Although I do get him mixed up with Eric D. Snyder sometimes, and they are completely different writers and presences.
So he's nothing to Zack Snyder.
He's not. No, it's not spelled that way either. It's EI.
Yeah.
But
it's all been positive anyway.
It's all been really, really positive. But the fact is, Pixar make more sequels than they did once upon a time. We have Toy Story 4 coming. We've just had Cars 3. We're getting The Incredibles 2. But I think the average standard is kind of similar. You know, it's not as stellar as it was in its first few years, but no studio can keep that going.
Yeah.
And I think they've done a pretty good job with everything they own. But obviously, the flip side of the coin is you're still looking at one entity owning everything. That is quite a concentration of risk, and it is quite a homogenization. But then when I look at the franchises I care about, I can't hand on heart say that I think Disney would do a worse job with them nowadays.
No.
I mean, I'm not going to bang on about Bond again because I did it a couple of episodes ago. But I do want Eon to sell. Now you can disagree with me on that, but my personal opinion is I want them to sell. And whilst I don't think Disney is necessarily the most natural home for a boozer and shag merchant, I don't hand on heart think Disney would do a worse job with that intellectual property overall, not just the films, overall. And I certainly think, well, I don't think Disney would fuck up Star Wars. Star Trek rather. I really don't. So yeah, part of me thinks, yeah, great, let's get all the Marvel characters back, and they're doing a good job with everything. Part of me thinks, yeah, it's still one company owning everything.
I do want to see
20th Century Fox has been one of my least favourite of all the studios in recent years.
Yeah, they've stuffed up most stuff, but then that's why they're selling, because they're not, by their own admission, it's a Murdoch board or whatever sort of thing. Well, look, our main product.
Not getting any younger as well. He wants to concentrate on the bits he's interested in, which is like bigoted news.
He wants to concentrate on Jerry Hall, and who'd blame him? Yeah. He wants to give more time to.
When John Terry quit, like Chelsea or something, it's like that News Thump or the Onion. I think it was a News Thump article where it said he was quitting to spend more time on adultery and racism.
Fair enough. Perfectly reasonable demands, really. But the only reason I really want the X-Men back in Marvel is because I just want that scene before he stands down and gets recast. And I mentioned this to you the other day of Tony Stark taking the piss out of Professor X or something, calling him, "Hey Kojak, no offense, but I don't want you inside my head unless you've got a parental filter." And so that sort of thing. I can just picture it. It's fan fiction, but I like it, So there you have it.
It is. I'm not that in love with the current X-Men universe. I mean, Hugh Jackman said he's not coming back. I'm relatively supportive of that because he's going on towards 50. We've got the Last Showman coming. Is it the Last Showman? Is it called?
Yeah, Barnum. Yeah.
Christmas, The Greatest Showman, which is coming out around Christmas. And he is a song and dance man by background.
Yeah, no, sure, yeah.
I don't really realise that.
He's a great actor.
I'm quite happy to see him do other things. He's given us plenty of Wolverine, and enough is enough. But even if he said, "I'll come back," he would be closer to the end than the beginning. And you think, well, First Class was great. I thought First Class was probably the best X-Men film. But
yeah, me too.
It was followed by Days of Future Past, which was decent.
Just fan fiction.
And then Apocalypse was utterly terrible.
Yeah.
So I'm not that bothered. I mean, they churn out X-Men films now and again to keep the license, but they're not doing really that great. And oh my god, they own Master and Commander,
which does need a sequel, big time. I'm
I
so pissed off that didn't do better at the time, because it was supposed to be like his. Because they couldn't do a sequel to Gladiator, even though Nick Cave did write one, but which was a bit surreal. I don't know whether you've heard about that. Which was kind of set in the afterlife.
It's basically the best Star Trek film we've had this millennia.
What, Master and Commander?
Master.
Yes. No, totally. But is Tarantino doing Star Trek? Is that a done deal? Have you heard about this?
It's been. It depends what you mean by doing.
Ooh.
No, I don't mean he's fucking. I didn't mean that. No, what I meant by it was that he's setting up. He's pitched to Paramount. Paramount, I've heard this through good sources, have accepted.
Yeah.
And that it's going to be R-rated. That's another conversation. I don't feel as strongly either way about it as anyone else. I think that the relative rating of Star Trek as a property just comes from its history as much as anything else. I mean, space is a frightening, dirty, dangerous place. I don't think it should be R-rated particularly, but I'm not immediately going to hit the roof that it might be. But he's setting up a writer's room, and there are various candidates to get involved with that. Well, Tarantino has never never directed anything other than his own script.
Mm-hmm.
So I think if you put together a writer's room, I would be very surprised if he directed it, unless that's to get early drafts out of the way while he concentrates on his sort of Manson property. But I don't see that. I don't see someone doing half of his work for him.
Yeah.
He mines his own material. So what I suspect Tarantino will be is effectively the sort of George Lucas exec producer role of the original Star Wars trilogy, apart from the first one.
Like poetry.
I think he'll be involved. I think he'll stay involved. I think he might be a bit like Nolan with Schneider on Man of Steel. He might get to sign off on the writers and director.
Because that ended
But
so well.
This is Tarantino. Occasionally, I say occasionally, in that it's not on the front of all his films, but his films will be numbered. He counts Kill Bill as one. So when The Hateful Eight came out, it was the 8th film by Quentin Tarantino. It's actually the 9th in terms of what we've had theatrically.
Yes.
But he reckons he's got a couple to go.
Right.
I don't see Star Trek being one of those two.
No.
No matter how involved he is, I don't think he will ever see it as entirely his.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because the other one you mentioned, do you remember you said in, I think, our first podcast, you mentioned Master and Commander there, but you also mentioned before, you said Crimson Tide is an excellent Star Trek film. Now, one of the writers on that,
I know where you're going with
this. Was Tarantino. So, by that rationale...
you can actually hear his dialogue because there's a load of chat about the Silver Surfer and stuff.
Yeah, which is actually quite out of place, but, you know...
Well, it is, but when you go and watch Reservoir Dogs and you see Mr. Orange's apartment, he's got a Silver Surfer poster on the wall. Tarantino's a Marvel fan. Tarantino's also a Star Trek fan. So people have seen the R rating and said, well, he doesn't get Star Trek. And I'm thinking, well, if there's anything Tarantino always gets, it's any well-known intellectual property. I think he understands most things, frankly. So the proof will be in the pudding. The one thing it does prove to me, and I'm not determined to be proved right all the time because I'm wrong often.
Really?
But certainly when Beyond came out and they announced that there was going to be a 4th with Chris Hemsworth in it, I immediately went, that's just fucking talk at the moment. Yeah. And here we are getting on for 2 years on from Beyond. Certainly 18 months. And we weren't any closer to a sequel.
Well, they didn't. To be fair, at the time, they didn't have the box office.
Young are writing together on something else at the moment. They're not writing on Star Trek.
Well, the rumor is that Pegg is actually, he's denied it. He said it was just, party talk. But there is a rumor that they're going to do From Dusk Till Dawn, which is going to be Shaun versus vampires rather than zombies. On the one hand, yes. On the other hand, the Cornetto trilogy is finished, so I don't know where it fits in, but I don't know. It'd be interesting, but probably just
where
bullshit.
It fits in is that, frankly, I do think my favourite output, by and large, of Edgar Wright has been the stuff he's done with Pegg and Frost.
Yes.
I think my favourite, the only real Pegg output I like, outside of his franchise work, because he's been fine in Mission Impossible and stuff like that, but the stuff where he's been the main man on a film, I've never wildly liked anything he's done apart from with Edgar Wright.
Yeah.
So, as much as you say, the trilogies might be over, well, the idea that those three might get together again a little bit later on in their careers wouldn't disappoint me at all.
Well, many teams do that. They sort of split up for a bit and then they come back. It's like poetry, rhymes.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned Nolan there very briefly.
Yes.
Obviously, Warner Bros. Couldn't be kissing his arse any more than they are at the moment. I don't know whether you've noticed the gigantic tribute to him with this 4K Nolan. And a couple of things. One, they're failing to understand it.
The Dark Knight trilogy is out in 4K in December.
He's not coming back. Warner's, you could write him $1 billion. He's not going to come back and make you a Nolan versus Batman movie. It's not going to happen. And to be fair as well, if we look back at this, now I love Man of Steel. I'm one of the defenders of it. If they just done Man of Steel 2, or better still, if they just started with a massive Justice League movie, they wouldn't be in the mess they're in. Having said that, the person who signed off on all of it, who was happy, at least contractually, if nothing else, or for residuals, to have his name as an executive producer, albeit not with any kind of creative control hands-on that DCU that's now finished and probably about to be rebooted because it didn't even make Justice League has only just turned 600 million, was Nolan. So if he's so bulletproof as a comic book movie guru just because of the Dark Knight trilogy, really he's not. He's as culpable to some extent, not in terms of the corporate decisions that got made, because those behind the scenes, as we're reading the leaks now, that apparently they released Justice.
He's not suited to cinematic universes.
No. But
it's all about his visions and his arcs.
Would he go back to Batman?
He's not interested in... No, he's done his Batman. He's done his take on Batman.
Would he do Bond? Batman. Is he doing Bond?
In team-ups.
Is he doing Bond, or is that bullshit?
I find it very hard to believe that Christopher Nolan will get to the end of his career and not do a James Bond film. It's his favourite thing in the world.
Right, but he's not doing the next one. That's bullshit. It's got to be.
I find it unlikely he will do the next one.
And I'll tell you why, because they've already had
I
the
don't
Nolan
know.
ones. The Mendes ones are Nolan. That's what Nolan would have done.
I
Same.
don't want it to follow Mendes. They'd be too fucking similar.
Exactly.
I don't think they're broadly super similar filmmakers, but when you watch the Mendes Bond films, they're kind of how I imagine a Nolan Bond film would be. Actually, in reality, they kind of wouldn't be, because everyone's going to bring their own vision, own casting, own sets, own set designers, and everything. But yeah, there was a lot of Nolan feel in those Mendes films, definitely.
Did you hear my pitch for the Nolan one, which is that it will be 6 hours long for a start, and it turns out that the entire Craig era was in fact set in the 60s, but it was being narrated in the present day by an elderly man who's in a sort of a coma.
Commander Riker on the holodeck.
Yes, and then at the very end, the last shot of the Craig era is as his life support machine is about to be switched off. You see that the nurse who's going to pull the switch is Vesper, and she winks to the camera, and you see his little talisman floating, and then the James Bond theme gears up with a Hans Zimmer dun 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 dun, and then they sell to Disney, and it's in universe.
I think the problem with I think people are very absolute now. I think it is part of the way the world's developed in a sort of online and social media era. That very few of us have fairly opinions aren't completely unequivocal. You know, that are just well on balance. I think there's not a lot of that around now. So Nolan is now to everyone either an absolutely unimpeachable genius, or it's the complete sort of backlash of what a fucking overrated hack. And the truth is kind of somewhere in between. Obviously, I mean, for me, Nolan in the 2000s, and I would count up to 2010. If you count 2010 in that decade, if you like. Was phenomenal. I just thought everything he did was terrific. His first two Batman films were great. I really loved Inception, and it broke all kinds of rules about show don't tell and stuff like that. But it just did it with such he did it with such commitment and heart, and it was a film that made you think. And you know, it's not pretentious for someone to want you to think. I like that. I love The Prestige. I thought it was a beautiful film as well, The Prestige. I think that might be actually the prettiest film he's ever done. This decade, he's produced Interstellar, which was interesting, but I didn't really warm to. He produced The Dark Knight Rises, which I'm still convinced to this day his heart wasn't wildly in.
No.
And then he produced Dunkirk, which we talked about on an earlier show, and appreciate broadly it was liked. I didn't like it. So the Nolan that's been active in the last 5 or 6 years worries me somewhat. But I've got to remind myself of a few things. He's still one of the most singular voices working in Hollywood. He's also one of the few people that can marry spectacle with ideas. And Bond is one of his favourite things in the world. And his favourite Bond film is my favourite Bond film. And that bodes really, really well. So, his favourite Bond film by a mile is On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and always has been.
Right.
He loves Bond, and there's a lot of Bond in his Batman. I mean, Lucius Fox is a comic book character, but he did bring a version of Q front and centre.
Oh, absolutely. Do you know that scene? You know that scene where he first gets the Batmobile in Batman Begins, and they drive it?
Yes.
Something about the visuals in that, or something. This is what I tried to articulate to you before, and I don't think I quite did it justice. My point being that there are moments of Moonraker that are high-tech and yet believable before they actually go into space, like the simulator thing where Roger Moore is in it. It's one of the few moments...
Moonraker, just to interrupt, Moonraker is, if you go back to my Bond rankings episode we did on Do You Expect Us to Talk? It's about episode 37, something like that.
Yep.
And it was around about summer 16, if you want to find it on the site. I didn't rank Moonraker very high, but there's two things I want to say. Firstly, I didn't rank it where most people rank it, which is in like the bottom 3. I ranked it higher than that. And secondly, there are very few James Bond films that look or sound better than that film. Moonraker's utterly beautiful, and it's got a wonderful score too. I don't hate Moonraker at all. It's ranked so low because there are a lot of better James Bond films.
Yeah.
But I don't think Moonraker's particularly bad, if I'm honest.
But when I said that you could do Moonraker well, like if they simply did decide, in the same way, if you like, they decided to call Casino Royale, despite the associations with the Feldman product and so on, and say, look, this is a remake. This is it done properly. This is it done well. Obviously, they wouldn't necessarily do that with one that had been an Eon canon film, but
you can't have two Moonrakers in your own canon.
That's right. That's right. So they'd have to call it something different. However, based on the fact that they've tried to dip into the real Moonraker, I made this point before. Die Another Day and Moon and GoldenEye both kind of use it a little bit. There is that precedent. The second thing is that if you look at Batman Begins, a couple of moments, the moment where he's driving the Tumbler for the first time, something about the visuals or the way they shoot that, for some reason took me right back to the bit it's like a nice version of the really nasty bit at the beginning of Moonraker where Roger Moore's Bond, and it's one of the few moments where, because people always talk about Roger kicking over the car or Roger trying to be hard or whatever it is, there's this moment, the simulator thing, the space simulation thing that woo woo woo.
Yes, no, I know exactly the bit you're on about.
Visually,
Roger Moore is probably his best scene in all of Bond, where he gets out of that thing and he looks genuinely fucked up by it.
Yeah, fucked up and fucked off. He just gives a look to Chang and he pushes Holly Goodhead away as though to say, look, I know you're probably not in on this, but
Moore at his worst would have been quite histrionic and acted that, but he didn't.
Yeah.
Really good,
Pierce would have gone, done a pain face.
Oh, Christ, can you imagine Pierce's face being... Oh, God, yeah.
I've come. Sorry. But what I'm saying...
Well, the thing with Moonraker is the book bears no relation to the film. It's just... The book is called Moonraker.
And that's about it.
You wanted to do something that was based in space because of Star Wars.
Well, yeah.
Moon's in that title, and it was a title they hadn't used.
Yeah.
They used the villain name. That was about it.
Nolan drew a parallel. He sort of said, look, Ra's al Ghul, who is a 70s creation from the Batman comics, he wasn't there at the beginning. He's not one of the kind of Joker, Penguin, Rogues gallery. No one had heard of him, in fact, I think, outside of the fandom for that movie. He felt a parallel to what was being used by Bond villainy at the time, which was the Cold War was still there, but it was kind of thawing. There was an increase in terror attacks, so there were new forms of terror that were happening in the Middle East and so on. But amidst all that, there was this nominally a creation for movies, and it happened, I think, a lot in Hammer horror as well, and a lot of kind of Spanish movies and stuff, of the idea of these cult movements where you get a supreme leader who wants to basically destroy or remake the world in a kind of a Hitlerian guise, but without it actually being World War II or actual terrorism or something like that. A take on Spectre, a take on Ra's al Ghul, all of that stuff, still keeping it in reality, but also managing to have a fabric of reality and fantasy, the visuals of fantasy, without going quite as far as shooting into space with lasers and so on. And it's that that makes me feel very optimistic for if Nolan does decide to do it. His more intellectual side makes me more pessimistic, but if you look at Batman Begins, I mean, ironically enough, Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises begin to influence Bond, but Batman Begins is itself influenced by Bond, as you point out, and of all the eras, because there's a bit of Pierce in there is a bit of camp, but it's done well. There's a bit of that kind of,
Visually, there is a bit of Pierce
in
Christian Bale as Bruce Wayne.
Yes, the way he conducts himself and so on.
Yeah, everything.
Yeah.
But when I think there's a couple of scenes in it where I think, oh God, that's so Bond, it hurts.
Yeah.
The bit where in the Dark Knight where he wants the new outfit because he can't move his head and he's being savaged by dogs and things. And Q, Lucius, opens the case for him or pulls out the drawer, and Bruce starts fucking around with it, not realising they're like magnetic or something, and the gauntlets come shooting out and like bury themselves in the wall. That's like Roger in Moonraker damaging like M's painting with the fucking dart on his wrist.
Yeah, and
there is a lot of Bond. There is a lot of Bond in his, and everyone draws the parallel with Inception as well. I think that was overstated, but visually there was a little bit of On Her Majesty's Secret Service in there.
Yeah, and Dark Knight Rises, License to Kill, the plane duel at the beginning. Also,
that was very License to Kill. That's the same plot point. It is the same plot point, except in License to Kill, I believe it was a helicopter and a plane, and in The Dark Knight Rises, it was two planes. Apart from that, it's more or less the same action.
And Elektra and Renard is not dissimilar to the dynamic that he deployed
That's
for.
Talia al Ghul and Bane.
Yeah, so there's precedent. I think if he takes the best bits, it could work. I do think it's unlikely that he's the guy who's hired for them for this upcoming one, but and I think they would have
Um,
announced it by now.
I find it difficult unless it's a twofer, unless it's a if you'll do this for us, we will give you more freedom on Bond 26.
Interesting. Well, we shall find out in the new year.
I throw it out. I throw it out as a possibility. Do I
Well,
think it's going to happen? Probably not. But there is a possibility that they say, okay, well, you can choose your own, your own people
hmm,
on Bond 26, and in fact, we'll even let you have final say on casting, for
yeah.
example.
I mean, Barbara Broccoli has promised something in the new year. Beautiful. Barbara, take your time. We don't, just stay beautiful and lovely.
I would just appeal to his ego because what Bond's gone out voluntarily on a great film?
Hmm.
I mean, a couple of them have gone out in truncated circumstances. I mean, obviously George did one; it was the best of them, but he only did one, and it wasn't considered the best at the time.
No.
Sean Connery went out on a bloody awful one. Roger went
Yeah.
out several films too late.
No.
Pierce went out on Die Another Day, which was horrific. I've jumped it, which I didn't mean to. Tim went out on a film that was a flop, even though I love it.
Hmm.
So I would be appealing to his ego. Break this fucking structure for us. Prove you can cross eras with us as well.
That's why, and you're absolutely right. They need you on side because that is how you win Nolan. Because he wasn't going to do Dark Knight Rises, and I think the studio said to him, A, creative freedom, and B, I think he himself sort of thought, well, the challenge here is how many trilogies have a satisfactory, even a good third episode, let alone one that even comes anywhere near the quality of the other two. And whilst Dark Knight Rises is much maligned, I adore it, as you know, for the cafe in Florence. Had to sneak it in, but it's in terms of quality. In terms of quality, it's not a complete screw
It's
up.
not as good as the first two. It isn't. It isn't.
Yeah,
But
it's not a Spider-Man 3.
if someone said, if someone, no, it isn't. It really isn't. I was having a debate with someone came to our YouTube page a while back and really slagged off our review of it. And I don't know. You're welcome to disagree with us. You're welcome to be rude if you want. I don't see the problem.
Ooh, oh, not rude like that.
But I don't know what people are expecting when we did. But that was a 2-hour, 40-minute episode. It's one of our longer episodes.
Yeah.
And so we spent 2 hours and 40 minutes rather seriously dissecting it and explaining exactly why we think what we think. Okay?
Mm.
So someone thinks they can write two sentences on our YouTube page and we'll go, yeah, you're absolutely right, I just changed my mind. I don't know what the best people think is going to happen there.
Bunch
But
of
I
lies.
decided to engage him and I replied with politeness because he was being quite aggressive.
Would you like me to have him killed?
Yeah. No, yeah, I haven't killed the bastard, but I was at least superficially kind. But and he actually said to me the last thing when he sort of started calming down because I said, "Look, I totally respect your opinion." But
It's just a movie, dickhead. It's not a matter of life and death.
This is life. This is like light entertainment. What is it you think I am damaging with this, if anything? And in fact, it's a fucking character I play anyway, because when I slag people off, that's not how I am in my real life. It's just light entertainment. It's all it is.
Yes.
But eventually he said, where would you rank The Dark Knight Rises? And in superhero films in general. And I said, well, actually, there's a few more. I prefer the two previous Nolan films. There's a small handful of Marvel films I'd put ahead of it. I mean, like probably... I think if I was literally putting it in amongst the Marvel rankings, it would be in the top 8 somewhere, but not very high in the top 8. And then I think, well, Superman, the movie's better than it. And then I start running out of options. I prefer it to all of the Spider-Man films, genuinely. Except Homecoming. I like Homecoming more, but certainly the first 5. And so it's relative, and I think that's the problem with Nolan. This is the backlash you get when you set such a high standard. Nolan has never been interviewed saying, I'm the successor to Stanley Kubrick. He's never said anything like that. It's only because he's a bit of an emotionally cool filmmaker in some ways, and his films are based around ideas, that people compare him to Kubrick. Well, I'm sorry, no, he's not the same type of filmmaker as Kubrick. And I got drawn into it when I reviewed them as well, because what Kubrick did was never let a shot out without analysing it to death, to a fault. Because, like I said, I think on one of the shows, that shot in A Clockwork Orange where someone spits in Alex's face, he did 98 takes of that. I mean, how many different ways is there to spit in someone's face? There was well over 100 takes of Tom Cruise walking through a door in Eyes Wide Shut. I'm thinking Tom Cruise is a competent actor. But then you go and watch something like The Shining, and I'm not talking about Room 237 or anything like that. I'm not talking about any of these ludicrous theories about it. But just watch the shot composition of something like The Shining, and you can freeze frame it in a lot of places and find the film is utterly symmetrical. This is the guy who just pours over every frame. Nolan isn't like that. You've got Batman fighting on the roof with Catwoman, and some guy falls over without anyone coming anywhere near him. Nolan is far sloppier in shot composition, but then he didn't draw the parallels with Kubrick. We did.
Yeah, he's also not an action director. He insists on not having a second unit, which I actually think is incredibly stupid. I don't know.
No, I don't agree.
Really?
I don't have a problem with his act. I think Nolan's biggest flaw for me now. The disclaimer here is so many times when you listen to Do You Expect Us to Talk, I struggle with third acts because action has to be something rather special to really get to me at all. Otherwise, I just find it so perfunctory at the end of a film. Oh, now they're fighting a bit. I don't care. When I look at something like Batman Begins, does it have wonderful action in it? No, but it has action that's entirely appropriate for the character of Batman and also how villains view him, see him, strike him from the shadows and stuff. My biggest problem with Nolan is the way he has people talk to each other. Now, it works in Inception where you've got to have people explain this plot to each other because, frankly, the plot is difficult. It's difficult concepts in that film. But, I mean, he does have people stand around explaining the themes to each other, doesn't he?
Yes.
And, you know, a much lesser filmmaker or much lesser director, shall I say, not necessarily a filmmaker because his influence on cinema has been so great. But look at how slaughtered George Lucas gets for that very thing.
Yes.
You watch the Star Wars prequels and they all stand around and stiffly explain themes to each other. Yes. Well, Nolan is not actually much better in that regard.
No.
But I find him visually fascinating. I find his use of IMAX fascinating. I appreciate his stance with films. I don't have any strong feeling on it actually, but if he wants to use film and IMAX and all that, I have quite a lot of respect for that.
Yeah.
And his films come out with a bit of authorship to them. So if he wants to do Bond, great. But I wouldn't sit and wait for Bond 26 because anything could happen. We could find ourselves back in a post-License to Kill situation that MGM hits trouble or something happens in the Broccoli family or to Michael G. Wilson or, suddenly you wait for like the killer Nolan product and then suddenly you miss his best years altogether. I'm already wondering if we've had the best of Christopher Nolan. So I just think, appeal to his ego and see if you can get him in for 25. Is he my absolute first choice for a Bond film? No. At this point, I would rather have Denis Villeneuve. But he's too talented and too fond of the series that I cannot believe he'll go through his entire career without doing one. And why wait till he's past it?
Yeah. And as you've pointed out, if we think about it, the thing that would stop him at the moment is bearing in mind that he's, for all of his originality, I think he was a movie fan, so he copies the beats and career of probably his heroes. Now, if we look at sort of Spielberg in this era, Spielberg began to do what certain movie stars do. I think it's, as Denzel Washington says, I do one for me and one for them. So if we regard Dunkirk as one for him, in the sense that it's a substantial, historical, very serious movie, he now knows that even though Dunkirk made obscene amounts of money for what it was, that his next one probably should be a bit more fun, so to speak. And if we assume that Warner's do want somebody to save the DCU, and it's not going to be Nolan, then Bond is on the table, frankly, and it makes perfect sense. But all that Barbara Broccoli has revealed is she said, look, there will be more announcements early in the new year, probably, and I think she's hinted that it would be director. The other interesting thing she mentioned, and I love this, I mean, I love everything she says, because every little thing she does is magic, but she said...
You just want to watch her talk.
Yes. Well, she's adorable. But she said she's a talented producer. But she said she was in Ireland and she said, yeah, we haven't ruled out Bond going there. Now, of course, strategically speaking, you don't get ISIL cells or Spectre organisations or things probably operating in Dublin, although one never knows. But it could just be Bond. I think it was James Bond Radio mentioned this, where they said, why not just have Tanner and Bond playing golf at Powers Court, which is a wonderful golf course. I also would be saying, why not have Bond at the Shelbourne hotel? That'd be a perfect honeymoon for him and whoever, or just a weekend chilling out. And you have him taken away from that, or equally because it's such an unlikely place for a villain to hide out. Maybe that's exactly where they could film something like The Garden of Death. It doesn't have to be Japan if they go that route for. Ireland is a spectacular potential location, as Star Wars has shown. The island where Luke is hiding out, Skellig
Not
is.
necessarily suits Bond particularly, but
Yeah.
I mean, why not? I think the thing is, like, when filmmakers turn up somewhere, it's no different from politicians. There's an art aspect to it.
He has been there though. Did you ever read the John Gardner continuation novel, No Deals, Mr. Bond? Did you hear about? I mean, I know you're not a continuation novel man, but he goes there in that. It's quite.
I'm not a non-canon guy, really, am I?
Yeah. Well, quite right too, because they're basically fan fiction. But yeah, Bond has been to Ireland technically
Exactly
in the John Garden. So so there you go.
It's the bizarre thing about suspension of disbelief. When you think about it, that I believe all these stories about a guy I know has never existed. But as soon as you write one for somebody else writes one, I go, yeah, but that's not real.
Well, that's the wonderful thing about it. But I think of the two,
It's not canon. I don't care.
of the two branches, shall we say, I'm more inclined to think that Nolan, as a business person, as much as anything else, we think, well, do you know what, Warner's, you've really messed up. Your leadership decided to release Justice League when it was unfinished, so you could get a last-minute bonus. You can demote and promote and reboot all you want, but your house is not in order at the moment. Bond, by contrast, although there's about to be a huge transition, is nonetheless well managed at the moment, despite the delay. And of the two, I think he's more likely to do Bond than he is return to Batman. But we shall see. We shall see. It's an exciting time.
If I was Christopher Nolan, I'd fucking buy Bond.
Could he afford it?
I'd be putting a consortium together and buying Bond.
Which is in and of itself, and I'd call the consortia Spectre. How about that? No, probably. It's taken, isn't it? Someone else has it. Damn it. Kevin McClory. Oh no, he's dead. Someone else. Someone else who wants to make a Bond movie.
Call it Octopus. Like when they could use Spectre and they had to call it that in the game.
So,
But yeah,
speaking of organisations and politics, we must attend to the business at hand. Let's talk these biopics. Which one do you want to go with first?
we'll go in order if you like, unless you have a specific order you'd like to cover them in.
Shall we go with JFK first then?
Quite happy to go with JFK first.
Yeah.
I think I've seen it twice. I think I've literally seen it twice. It took me a long time to see it, and I can't think why. Always loved films. An awful lot of I agree with American history and politics. I've always found both fascinating. Modern American history and politics. So this is right in my wheelhouse, but I didn't see it until, I'm guessing, maybe 10 years, when it was about 8 to 10 years old. Probably when I was at university myself. And I saw it again in prep for this. And I think I can actually, thinking about it, I know why I didn't see it. When I was growing up and getting very serious and earnest about films, as most film fans go through a phase of that, I think it never. I think that's like pretentiousness never quite leaves us, but we do get to a point where we can enjoy fluff, and stuff like that. But when I went through a phase, I mean, I'm a noted Jurassic Park detractor, and I'm sure half of that was it was released when I was about 16 and all into indie film. But when I look at JFK, I think it's transcended by a performance from someone I never thought capable of that performance, because Oliver Stone is somebody who I think it's a bigger deal in that country to be critical of your country. So I think Oliver Stone stands out as a lot more radical for being actually quite blunt, really. I don't find him a particularly subtle filmmaker. I don't think subtle is a term you'd ever apply to him. And he seems to be going out of his way to find conspiracy theories. And I think he always goes a little bit too far. This film ends with a monologue that's got to be over 15 minutes long from Kevin Costner. Now, Kevin Costner is an actor that at his peak I always found really, really bland. I couldn't understand why he was a star. Now he's an older man and no less bland. Whenever I see him, I'm always pleased to see him. I was always really, really pleased to see him as Jonathan Kent. I think that's genius casting him as Jonathan Kent. But really bland. You know, I watch something like The Untouchables. Yes, he is playing a fucking goody two shoes, but there's just no. You know, I think the only film in that era where he ever subverted expectations of him would have been No Way Out.
Yeah, and even that's the
Which is
twist at the
famous.
end. It's not, he's not coloured from the beginning as kind of a, he's
Yeah.
basically the all-American hero to ostensibly.
It's famous. That film's famous for one scene, and it's got nothing to do with the themes of the film.
Hmm.
You know,
Do you remember from the first podcast? I kid you not, Lorella from the first podcast is exactly like, as in a doppelganger for Sean Young in that. Although sadly, every time I do meet her in London for tea and I ask her to recreate that scene from No Way Out, it just isn't happening. But hope springs eternal for 2018.
yeah, that's a very difficult scene to ask someone to. That's very casting couch.
I'd have to hire a limo.
Anyway.
No, it's not casting couch, because I've known Lorella for some years, and I think we have an understanding that maybe just in the interest of recreating my love for No Way Out and for the creative possibilities therein, no, she's not buying it. She's messaged me, James, stop it, it's bullshit.
Anyway, back to the
Yes.
point. A microcosm of the film is that monologue, because it goes on about 3 or 4 minutes too long.
Are there any cuts in it, Dave? Like, does it, like the way people talk about continuous shots, and sometimes they cheat a bit?
It isn't. No, it's not a continuous shot. It cuts.
Right.
It cuts back and forth footage. It goes back to things we've seen during the film.
Right.
You see footage of Gary Oldman's, Lee Harvey Oswald. That wasn't shot in one. They used different camera angles in the courtroom. No, that's not one hit. Whether he narrated it in one hit, but even then, it wouldn't match. No, I'm pretty sure that was all cut together. But it's not that it's too long, because I could have listened to hours of that, to be honest. But he just takes it a bit too far. The whole sequence set up what he thinks has happened. It goes all into the magic bullet theory. It takes us so plausibly through a set of events and just does what a good lawyer does and takes feeling out of it and just points at things and says, that cannot logically be true. And logically this. And it's spellbinding. And in about the last 2 or 3 minutes, he starts going on about, he starts going on about people being poisoned and accidents and all the rest of it and how much longer as a nation. And I just think, Oliver Stone has grabbed the script and like fucking scribbled over it with that, because he just doesn't know where to stop himself. And it's a microcosm of this film. All of these films are too long. It takes a long time to get going. I mean, it's a beautiful film. It's got almost a dreamlike quality to it, JFK. It's very slightly overexposed. It's got a Superman the movie look. It could easily have been, had he been still alive, Jeffrey Unsworth lensing this. It's just got this lovely period glow to it. I love it to look at. But the first half of the film is doing nothing but just talking about possible conspiracy theories without outlining what it is. So they're being urged away from things and not being funded for things and talking to certain people off the record. And nothing is coalescing into anything. This film rises on 2 monologues, one from Kevin Costner and one from Donald Sutherland, and they're both spellbinding. But they're also Oliver Stone's shortcomings in one foul swoop, that he knows nothing more than to literally tell us what the themes of his films are.
Which is a bit like what we were saying about Nolan and Lucas and so on, to some extent. It's not... and it's funny, because when we get to Snowden, you mentioned the parallels with The Firm. Well, there's a scene in The Firm where Tom Cruise sits... I mean, The Firm is itself...
I mentioned it on here then, so we'll have to come back to
Yeah,
it.
I mean, The Firm is itself a very copied film, but there's a scene in The Firm where Tom Cruise is sat outside the White House in the snow, and a fellow in a hat gives us a minor exposition about what The Firm is. Exactly the same way. Obviously, this was made a couple of years before The Firm, so if anything, there's a bit of cross-fertilization between maybe imagery or whatever, but the Donald Sutherland sat down on a bench telling Costner what's happening, but also telling him to sort of, if you delve any further...
That in itself's a bit of a cliche. That's like size meeting and just using a vague line to each other,
But you have, I mean, the thing is with screenwriting, you have to do that to some extent. You have to have an exposition moment at some point.
I don't want to be too critical of it, but the fact is the film is unbalanced by being basically 2 stunning monologues, one of which is way too long.
Yeah.
And then a load of innuendo for the rest of the film around something's going on, but nobody's quite sure what.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned
And
innuendo, and
after all of
you know,
that, much of that speech, it isn't like watching Poirot or something, in that everything you've just watched coalesces into an explanation that you then go, I can see that, I can see that, I can see that. Relative to the film, a lot of what Costner says in that monologue at the end is pulled right out of his ass. We haven't seen that without knowing we've seen it or anything like that.
yes. No, I think
But it is no point. But you can watch those two monologues and then switch it off. That would do.
yeah. No, that's true. I think in terms,
it would be about 25 minutes of film.
it would.
I mean, it would still be a substantial chunk of watching. And John Sutherland's great anyway. I could watch that guy forever.
It would probably I mean, in today's world, it might function better as a Netflix series or something in that sense.
JFK should be 6 hours on Netflix. That's what it should be.
Because I mean, most of it's so difficult because the thing is, all of the pieces that they're talking about do exist. There is an industrial military complex. There is a CIA. There was a mob. There was a Cuban fraternity. There was Castro. There was a Soviet empire. And JFK was a brilliant, well-intentioned, beautiful, respected, heroic, but also, he was an impulsive, impetuous pup as well. We have to go there. There's no question.
But politician, in political terms, he was very, very young.
Yeah, he wasn't. I don't think
he was very young to be a president.
I don't think he was ready, and I think that there's a generation, the baby boomers particularly, who idolize him, and they think it was some act of great heroism and vision that he brought the world to a nuclear standoff. Well, to be frank with you, in retrospect, if I'd been running the intelligence...
That's a high-stakes game.
Yeah, and I don't think the Russians... I think sometimes the Russians were bluffing. I think sometimes...
What I don't buy about it, from my little bit of knowledge, is he massively stepped up the presence in South Vietnam. He sent over like 16,000 advisors and stuff. If anything, everything I've ever learned about JFK's attitude to that region is that he was totally escalating everything, and yet the film postulates that they killed him because he wouldn't deliver them their war.
Yeah. Which
I think is kind of a bit juvenile. There's just something about Oliver Stone's attitude to these things that I think that's Oliver Stone. I can imagine he's well read on it. I can imagine he did his research, but it's Oliver Stone doing some very high level, very intellectual research, and then coming up with a petulant child's solution to it all. That's how Oliver Stone plays to me in a nutshell.
Yeah.
That he brings it back to very basic themes that carry some weight because people are obsessed with money and people are obsessed with power. But Oliver Stone, apropos of nothing, will constantly drift everything back to that. And it doesn't. And LBJ comes off as a complete warmonger, sort of in on it all. And I just think, grow up. I just think grow up. It doesn't ring true to me. Does everything he says about it not being Lee Harvey Oswald, because none of that makes sense? Yeah, if that's all true, then so much of that film is very plausible. But he takes us through a film, carefully constructing a case, leaving almost things out, because like I say, there's stuff in the monologue at the end that we haven't seen. But he carefully constructs a sort of a situation with a calm head and really thought through stance, and then petulantly splits out a load of bollocks to summarise it at the end, and that's Oliver Stone to me. I often watch his stuff and think he needs to fucking grow up a bit.
Yeah. As do I, in fact. I've just had a message from Lorella that says if you ever try that No Way Out maneuver, trying to film that, you can forget afternoon tea. James, be a thorough gentleman, nothing else. Isn't that lovely? Actually, I know I'm making that up, but that would be her response. But speaking of Stone and his being immature...
You missed out on some tea, that's all right.
Yeah, well, it's a win-win situation. No, the long and the short of it is, she's not going to recreate the No Way Out scene, or in any way go there. Just to clarify, it's not on the table. But with Stone, by contrast,
that's a great scene.
Stone, by contrast, does go there, so to speak, because the thing I have to go to, and I don't know why, in God's name. I mean, we mentioned No Way Out, which isn't an Oliver Stone film, but has Costner and has this beautifully consensual, lovely, passionate sex scene in it, right? Which is choreographed and wonderful and fits into a thriller and justified by the fact that it drives the plot along, right? You go to JFK, and about halfway through, I think it is, apropos nothing, there is a scene which I'm not going to call Oliver Stone homophobic, because I don't think that's fair, but there's a scene of sadomasochistic, homosexual, orgy stuff, where Tommy Lee Jones's character, Clay Shaw, Kevin Bacon, and Joe Pesci are dressed in some sort of, I don't know, theatrical costumes, and they're painted gold, and they're snorting coke off each other's tits and cock or something, and it's just, I don't know why he threw that in there. Explain to me why that's in that film.
And then I've got no. It's just to add a sense of the grotesque.
Yeah.
And then of course it makes leaps of. We hear him say, is it Clay Bertram?
Clay Shaw, yeah.
The alternate name he used.
Clay Shaw, yeah.
But he uses an alternate as well, but he uses an alternate name, and we see him give that in his statement to police. It's not written down properly, and then he denies it in court. And it's like, well, if it was inadmissible in court, you can't just assert that's what happened.
Yeah.
So that was all a bit awkward. But yeah, I thought that was fucking stupid, actually. I really do. And again, I just watch it and think, grow up. What are you trying to say? These are bad people because they're gay? What is it you are trying to say here?
Is it, so it's not just me. Is it me jumping to that conclusion, or are you on the same page with me on that?
No. I think it was trying to paint them as morally bankrupt through having absurdly overactive appetites and a sense of the grotesque.
Yeah. Now, the thing about it is, the reason I go there is that the script itself almost, I hate the phrase metatextually, but there's no other way I can say it, calls it out. There's a scene between, I was going to say Elliot Ness. I mean, they're basically the same character. What's his name in the film?
Jim Garrison.
Garrison, yes,
Jim
thank
Garrison.
you. Garrison and his wife. And his wife says, you're just persecuting that poor Mr. Shaw because he's gay. And I just thought, that's very interesting. Why would you throw that up? Because it's unlikely that Garrison fed them that line. And yet this is in a movie where, in effect, the text of the film is persecuting the gay characters by associating what was then a sordid underworld with.
Stone saying I'm not homophobic, honest.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Sorry, Oliver, but
it is. I mean, frankly, and I'm not saying he is homophobic, but that has given that impression. And you can only say what you say. I felt a bit sorry for Sissy Spacek in this film. It reminds me of like Adrian in the Rocky films. Her whole job is to fucking whine all the way through. I'm sorry for.
But once again, in the Costner canon, that's also a pattern. It's not, as I say, it's not Costner's fault. But you go to The Untouchables, and it's not Sissy Spacek.
He's always got the higher calling, whatever the cost.
Yeah, and the wife in The Untouchables plays a very similar role. She's subsequently gone on to be in House of Cards, and in various things where she's really done an amazing job, and where she gets to shine a bit more. I'll get the name in a second. I'll just Google it or whatever. I'll put it in the show notes. But yes, there's an actress in The Untouchables. It'll come to me in a second, who plays a very similar role to what Spacek. Yes, Patricia Clarkson. And she even looks a bit like Spacek. They even look a bit alike, don't they?
She does actually. Yeah, she's got a similar quality. Actually, she was a guest star in like a season or so of Frasier.
What does she play in that?
Frasier was a love interest of his. And like perfect for him, but when he gets together with her, he's still like interested in her friend who's like really loud-mouthed and stuff. It's an interesting plot point. She obviously he ended up with Laura Linney in that, which was probably more appropriate. But of all the women he dated in that series, for the character, she was probably the best for him.
Yeah.
But yeah, she was in that. Patricia Clarkson's a wonderful hate this term because it's so like reductive as to what somebody is, but she's a very good indie actress.
So if we treat JFK if we treat it as a murder mystery, which it is because no one ever solved it, the rules of murder mystery, generally speaking, are like this: either you do have a conspiracy or you don't. And I think in In most murder mysteries, if one even attempts to write a murder mystery, you have
I'm laughing
strands.
because basically most of the time Oliver Stone doesn't know, but you'll shit stir anyway.
Precisely. And you have strands where you think it's someone who has done it, and you point to the most obvious people, and it turns out that it's not them. Or you point to this gigantic conspiracy, and it turns out that the victim who was murdered by accident. They got run over by accident, someone covered it up, or they got murdered by a bang on the head from a jealous lover. They weren't, in fact, murdered by a cabal of arms dealers or pedophiles or whatever they have as a twist. Inspector Morse does that quite a lot, actually. So I bring up Morse quite a bit, where you start with huge potential webs of intrigue, but when you unravel it and you unravel it and you unravel it, you realise, yeah, sometimes there is just a lone gunman who's a nutcase. Sometimes the wrong person does get killed. Sometimes it is just a jealous husband
I
or
just
something.
think, even if you're looking back on something that at this time was like 27, 28 years before, even if you're looking back over a long period of time, there were major players that were still alive at this point. I mean, Christ, even major politicians of that era were still alive and still in Congress and so on. And I just think there is something irresponsible about his brand of filmmaking, that he makes a series of good points and then starts talking, and maybe this was in the trial notes of Clay Shaw's, I don't know.
Yeah.
But you've got Kevin Costner making a very sensible, lawyerly speech, but doing it with the elan of a film star, i.e., it is a lawyer talking, but it's Kevin Costner, the film star, doing it, so it's working. And then the last 3 minutes is all about suicides that were actually murders, and how we're killing off people because of these dark forties. No evidence for any of that. Zero, zip, none. And it's just shit stirring from a filmmaker who just doesn't know when to stop.
Do you think there's means, motive, and opportunity, though? If we go with murder mystery, if we get Oliver Stone's agenda for a second, prima facie, did people have the reason, the ability, and the timing to kill John F. Kennedy in a conspiratorial...
Ability, you've always got the ability.
Well, because somebody did kill him, that's a fact, so yeah. But...
So anybody can be murdered.
Sure.
I mean, if you talk about reason, well, the film never really sells me that. The film never really sells me that give us our war. I don't quite... The film doesn't sell me that at all. Maybe, but you could have done a better job at selling that to me.
Yeah.
And why is LBJ suddenly not bored? Because no one. The film doesn't say to us that LBJ is told we'll make you president if. It's just that they informally know he's going to be compliant, and then he's like, "I'll give you your war," and it's like, why?
Yeah.
Why? LBJ's presidency, for all of his faults, because LBJ was a noted womanizer, so that never gets talked about in the same way as Kennedy's.
No.
But LBJ did a lot of social programs. A lot of social programs. There are a lot of people in the 60s who got pulled up by their bootstraps for things that LBJ put out there. And we're supposed to believe that the very same man was completely blasé about sending young men off to die. Well, that's quite a schizophrenic fucking personality, isn't it? So,
Well,
yeah, it's a very good film, unbalanced by the fact that it's about two wonderful monologues. But even one of those monologues outstays its welcome, not by being too long, but just descending into fucking tittle-tattle towards the end.
do any of the other cast members stand out particularly? There's a cameo from John Candy, bizarrely, which I quite like. He stands out as a...
John Candy is really pantomime-ish in it,
Yeah.
but I think you would have hired him knowing that.
Yes.
It's a really cartoonish little sort of bit on the stand, isn't it?
Yeah. It's a fantastic performance from Gary Oldman as well.
Gary Oldman's great. Of course, you watch the film in the start, and of course he's killed off early, and you think, when you first watch it, you think, what a waste of Gary Oldman, but obviously you see a lot of him going forward. And Gary Oldman's, can play, he played Jim Gordon, and he played him as a lovely, lovely, lovely man, but he can play unsettling, and he can play evil, and he can play ambiguous. He's actually a really good choice. Of all things, I was just really happy to see Tommy Lee Jones back when he cared.
What do you mean by that?
Because I think there's an...
You mean he's been phoning it in?
I think you can generalise about that. I'm sure he won't feel that way. But Tommy Lee Jones in this film just looks, well, he's younger for a start, but he looks young and fit and motivated and ready to do this. And you watch him in some later films and you think, you don't even look like you enjoy doing this anymore. How much of that is projection from me, I don't know.
I think the thing is he was obviously at this stage not a name. I mean, he'd been in the business for 10 to 15 years as a character actor. He was known in the industry.
But this was pre The Fugitive.
It's pre-Fugitive, yeah. And The Fugitive, makes him massive as, a phone it in, on the one hand, support, mentor, villain, antagonist, whatever. Hence his woeful miscasting then in Batman Forever. Even though on paper, once again, that made a lot of sense, but equally, the action hero, which the thing is, even though he's not ostensibly obvious to that, because of he's not kind of a matinee idol, you believe him as an action character, and I think that's probably where it got a little bit confused, because he is a name, he's not necessarily the kind of name that opens, but as a supporting character, particularly in action, he's good to the extent that I can see why, even though it turned out to be a bit of a damp squib. On paper, once again, his role in that last Bourne film made so much sense, and yet this was not premium Tommy Lee Jones. Bit like Captain America as well, to some extent. I mean, that it could have been anybody. I mean, it was him, but it wasn't him. Harrison Ford has a similar phase, to the extent that I wonder if they did find Tommy Lee Jones a part now. That I don't know if they brought him, if they rebooted, well, not rebooted, if they did a soft Fugitive U.S. Marshals Part 3 or something, would he love to do that? But yeah, here it's pure character acting.
I just wish that, like, Oliver Stone, someone would get hold of him, knock 20% off the running time of his films. I don't mind them being longish, but they're always too long, and just rein him in a bit, because there are two monologues, I keep referring to it, there's two monologues in this for both of them, absolutely spellbinding to listen to, and you could just play them again and again to listen to the detail, and also being delivered so well. And like I say, we get 12 minutes, let's say, into the 15. And if you guillotined it there, you'd go, this is fantastic. But then the last 3 minutes are all about how, like, all our public figures are being, like, killed off for nefarious reasons. And it's just like, you've just had to take it that bit too far, haven't you?
Yeah. But I think, as a movie, despite its flaws, I mean, John Williams' score, for example, is really good. And I think he echoes a bit of it, doesn't he, in Jurassic Park? The I think comes up in Jurassic Park then the following year. I'm not saying John Williams rips himself off, but the bit, there's that conspiracy.
He's got his style, isn't he?
Yeah. I mean, it's not the sort of the Spielbergian John Williams. This is a bit more of a leaner, tougher kind of thrillery.
It's really good though, but I can still tell it's John Williams.
Yeah, but on the whole, I think it's
right, I didn't know.
It's worth a watch, and it obviously generated enough interest and enough money for Nixon to be greenlit, I suspect, as a quasi-sequel, insofar as similar themes, similar ideas, and that brings us into Nixon, I think. Nixon, what do you think? Unless you want to say more about JFK?
No, I'm happy to move on from JFK, because actually I think most of the film is so what.
Yeah.
I keep referring to two monologues because they're two fantastic bits of the film.
Yeah.
Expertly cut as well. They aren't just about what people say. They're cutting footage together to describe what we're seeing, and you've got the Zapruder film being really used very well as well. Nixon is a difficult one because, again, I'm watching Anthony Hopkins fucking using his face, using the talents he's been given. And it's only when you go back with certain actors that you go, yeah, he used to be that good. It's not that they're bad now, but you go, you used to be that good. The problem is you can't polish a turd, and Nixon is not this big, inspiring speaker. I've heard a lot of Nixon speeches and speaking over the years. The film finishes on, like, one of his speeches, and it's like, there's not much you can do with this guy. He was kind of a little bit oily and shifty anyway. The film really overdoes how sweaty he is. The amount of sweat they put on this man is fucking ludicrous.
It's a caricature.
And the film is miles too long. The interesting stuff was all his lead up to the White House. because it starts with the '60 election, because he lost the 1960 election to JFK. A lot of that around the sort of first televised debates between presidential candidates. The fairly well-known fact about that is that people who listened on the radio felt Nixon had won. Those who watched on the TV felt JFK had won. Because Nixon looked shifty and uncomfortable and had been unwell and was overtired and had 5 o'clock shadow, etc., etc. And it takes you through a couple of years later. Is it a gubernatorial race? I can't remember that. But he gets beaten again, and you see that. He promises his wife he's out of the game. His wife's played by Joan Allen, who I love anyway. Joan Allen's a wonderful actress. If you haven't seen it, check out another film that set around the White House that she was in called The Contender.
Yes, yeah, I did see.
Made in 1999, Jeff Bridges film. She's a vice presidential. She's a cabinet. Let me start that again. She is a candidate within that to be vice president. And now I haven't seen that film for a very long time, so I can't remember if the previous one has died or had to leave in scandal, or whether indeed Jeff Bridges has been sort of promoted up to the presidency because of death or whatever. But it turns out Joan Allen, or there is rumour that Joan Allen, back in sort of fraternity college sort of days, engaged in some sex game. I can't remember some of the detail, but it doesn't really matter. And all the way through the film, she's playing a straight bat and refusing to answer, on the basis that it has nothing to do with her ability to do the job. People do various things in college anyway, and basically, fuck you to everyone asking the question. And I've always thought through that film she was wonderful ever since. She's one of the more memorable bits of the Bourne films she was in.
Yeah, and her absence is she's conspicuous by absence in the recent 2 episodes.
Yeah, because of course she was replaced by fucking Tomb Raider, and that's not even the same fucking thing as as Samuel L. might say. So I thought the casting was strong, mainly because he's making an effort. There is a bit of caricature in there because he's over made up, and there are points in this, but it's broadly sympathetic to him, and we kind of possibly needed that, because Nixon has been a pantomime villain right through to him being like a fucking robot president in Futurama. You know, the guy was a public servant, albeit a flawed one, and it did play on little things like his extraordinary loyalty to his wife, because his wife's prickly. She threatens to leave him a couple of times, and he gives in. He does what she wants quite a bit, and there's a point in the film where they're trying to lay on women for him, and he wants none of that. The film portrays him as essentially decent, but a little bit petulant, with quite a temper, and quite a foul mouth. So it plays into the flaws about Nixon that we know, but overall I think I can characterise the painting of him as positive. The problem with that bit is, like I say, you can't polish a turd. You can't finish on a speech and go, wow, what an inspiring man he was, if the speech was shit. And there's not much you can do with him from that perspective. There have been innumerable presidents in the television age that are way better in front of a camera and an auto cue than Nixon ever was. The film's about an hour too long, deeply unfocused in that I don't really know what the film's about, other than to, it's partly about him being kicked out of the White House. It's partly about, him looking back on him recording all those things that ended up sort of catching him out. But the best bits of the film are the first hour, on sort of his rise to power and what sort of man he was there. So yeah, it's a wildly unfocused film, and far too long. What did you think?
I honestly don't know what to think about it, because I can't hate it, because there are moments of moments of genius, but there are also,
that's the thing with Oliver Stone, as much as he frustrates me, he's undeniable talent.
Yeah. But I think, what I like about it is this. I like the fact that, as you point out, it doesn't make yet another easy... Because the thing about, as you point, Nixon is such an easy target. And he was, he's dead for a start, so it doesn't require any particular strength to stand up to him. The second thing is, it's... The things that he did in the scheme of it were sins of, I suppose, weakness rather than grotesque malice. I've heard of far worse things being done in political machinations. It was his mistake to get caught. And I think the film captures that very well in the sense that they're not saying that
Well,
this
it
was.
captures the pain of losing. It doesn't make too much of it, but it captures the pain of losing. That being sat alone in your suite
Yeah.
before you go to do sort of concession speech, when you don't even want to do the concession speech, it's becoming clear you haven't won.
Yeah.
And he's got a wife who's a very nuanced characterization of his wife in that she doesn't throw her arms around him and say, never mind, Dick, we'll get him next time.
Yeah.
She's kind of a little bit distant and cold when he loses.
Yeah.
So you can see why he doesn't want to lose again. He lost the 1960 election. Then, of course, you've got the death of JFK in there, which the film paints him as feeling somewhat guilty about without really telling us why. But of course, he then would have had to live through JFK being somewhat sainted in political terms, certainly not in private terms, but in political terms in the years that followed. And a whole generation of Vietnam escalating under Democrat control because of an election he lost.
Mm.
And you can imagine that, he wins the 68 election, which he expected to be no part of. We sort of see the moment when LBJ says, I'm not standing.
Mm.
And he looks genuinely surprised, Nixon, when he hears this. Goes on to win the election. The film tells me that is, without being too unsubtle about it, that Nixon's sense of his own grip on power being kind of fragile. That film sells me that. I can imagine that he would feel insecure because we see him get beaten 2 or 3 times in this film. And again, he's not surrounded by the warmest of people. He's not surrounded by people who throw their arms around him and make him feel better about himself.
Yeah, I mean
that's so the Nixon of this film, despite having a loyal wife there and kids, and we see Checkers, the famous dog of his. This Nixon feels lonely to me.
Yeah, I think it does capture that well. Yeah, I mean he's not a complete loser. His inner steel is very much clear in the sense that he has a belief, a sense of destiny, like most leaders.
He's got endless. He comes back. He keeps coming back from the punches. He keeps fighting through. He gains power.
Yeah.
And fundamentally, certainly on a personal level, it's a lazy way of doing it, but it does make the point. He gets a nice free chance to have women and all the rest of it, and he's like, no, that's not what I'm about.
But they do imply that he had a drink problem. Are they implying he was an alcoholic?
Yes, I think so. I think that, the degree of sweat adds to that. Although the thing is, when he lost that debate in 1960, quote unquote lost, because obviously these are interpretive. A lot of it focused on he was looking clammy, and I think he did sweat quite freely. But of course, drink makes that worse.
I didn't know that.
It's not the most subtle of filmmakers, so we need to see he sweats a bit, so fucking drenching. Yeah.
I mean, I think what's interesting, for me, the reason I always find it interesting is because of the fact that it got made at all. Because, as I say, they're trying to quasi-sequelize and to some extent even remake, but with a different president. But within the biopic format in a way that JFK wasn't a biopic, the same brand. Because even though Nixon's not assassinated, they try to, I think, imply that Watergate is a conspiracy of which he's not entirely the author. And they have a fictional character who I don't think is a real...
That's all you need, really.
They have...
I think the thing with it is, I remember Nixon's death. And I also remember a few months before he died, he went to China, funnily enough, because there is that saying, only Nixon could go to China. And he was somewhat... The spin on it wasn't deliberately spun, I don't think. But the whole feel of the press around him getting back into diplomatic missions and stuff when he was 80, 81, right near the end of his life, was this whole thing about maybe this will rehabilitate him. So fully 2 decades after his ejection from office, he was still pretty toxic. And bear in mind, it was only... Ford came in. Ford was only president for 2 years. Ford pardoned him. First thing he did. But, that was almost political expediency.
So who's the character
So
that they have? Is it a purely fictional character they have played by Larry Hagman? He's basically playing J.R. Ewing. Did you notice that? They're trying to
I
say
didn't.
that there's
I
a
don't
sort
really
of
think
a
I thought about it.
there's kind of an industrial military complex equivalent. You know, if the industrial military complex are the big villains of JFK, Nixon seems to imply
Yeah.
that there was this kind of oil uh, billionaire or something in Texas who happens to be played by the guy who was famous for playing a nasty oil magnate.
An oil man.
Yeah, and the idea being that Nixon is presented as actually standing up to him and saying, well, no, I'm not going to be compromised, I'm not going to do X, Y, Z, but at the same time being kind of in league with him. And he's, if you like, a chorus character who constantly, anytime Nixon falls, threatens to make Nixon fall. So Oliver Stone is having his cake and eating it a bit, I think.
But that's where you've got the sense of sequelization, James, because he's just come off a film 4 years before, where he postulates that a president is killed for refusing to do the bidding of ostensibly actually more powerful factions. So he comes into this film, and it's almost like a sequel in that if you watch it fresh off JFK, the implication is that those are the dangers of not doing the bidding of these shadowy figures. So the theory there is Nixon could easily have been assassinated,
But wasn't.
but wasn't. And if that was your theory, it kind of falls over because he was president for a good chunk of time. He did like 6 years of it, or nearly 6 years, and he wasn't the most charming human being in the world.
No.
You know, it's not like you can imagine him handing his way through life and getting himself out of scrapes.
Yeah.
I struggle to understand, apart from sheer determination. I mean, the characterization of him is very much artisan to sort of JFK's artist, in that he doesn't have the natural looks, charisma, or anything else of a JFK. But what he has is an intense and unquenchable work rate.
Style versus substance.
Yeah, that's not fair either, because he's not saying he's got more substance. I mean, a lack of ability to speak well is not necessarily more substance.
No.
But it's saying that he can't charm his way through elections in the same way. So, you know, he was never going to go through his career unbeaten, I think. But
yeah,
he overcomes those natural deficiencies by just persevering. He just keeps trying.
Yeah.
And eventually he lands the presidency. And then is hoisted by his own petard because, you know, he records everything, hoping to get, you know, some banging memoirs out of it. And it's a really complex story, but like I say, the most interesting parts of the film are his rise to power. Everything around Watergate is a bit like W, which we'll come to in a minute. People sat around talking in rooms, and it's over long and very unfocused.
It handles
because I don't even know.
It handles the gay underworld slightly more with more refinement. There's obviously we know that J. Edgar Hoover was indeed a homosexual, and there's a scene where, brilliantly played by Bob Hoskins, although Joe Pesci turned it down, funnily enough. There is a scene where
Bob Hoskins is a miscast for me because it's the legendary lack of subtlety. You can't cast him in any way ambiguous. You cast Bob Hoskins in full-on gangster mode.
Yeah. Well, he was the original choice for Al Capone in The Untouchables. We go back to The Untouchables. Bob Hoskins was, I think, given...
That's not quite the story. Not quite the story with The Untouchables. It's very similar to the story around John Gavin for Diamonds Are Forever. The first choice for Al Capone in The Untouchables was Robert De Niro, who ended up playing the role. But they couldn't get him. Or they weren't sure if they could get him. So they needed effectively an insurance policy in place. So they went to Bob Hoskins, offered and then paid him $250,000 and said, this is to play Al Capone, but we have to tell you up front, we want Robert De Niro, and if we get him, we will go that way, but you will keep that money. So
uncommonly decent of
actually,
producers.
When you watch Robert De Niro in that film, he's very Bob Hoskins-like.
Yeah. I think that kind of decency is either a mixture of De Palma, but also the producer Art Linson.
They did the same. Eon did the same with John Gavin.
Yeah.
Everyone says he nearly played James Bond, well, only tenuously, because they wanted Connery, and if they couldn't get Connery, they wanted to keep Lazenby.
Yeah.
And what they said to John Gavin was, here is, and I forget how much they pay him, I think it was $500,000 in that case. And they said, here is the money to play James Bond, but be aware, we want one of these two guys. But if we can't get them, you're the man.
It is uncommonly decent, though, and I think, as I say, the producer, Art Linson, who did The Untouchables, actually...
It's very smart.
And he married a wonderful English actress. Just give her a shout out, called Fiona Lewis. Now she has a memoir out at the moment, which is really worth it, a great read. I don't know how accessible it is yet, because obviously I think it's only just been released. But I think it's called Some Mistakes Were Made or something like that. And it's just she's a marvel. She's someone who should have been a much bigger name, actually, I think. But because she writes and does so many other things, I think acting was just simply one of the things that she did, rather than it being her sole career. Was kind of in that kind of Charlotte Rampling sort of mode of exquisitely, classically English beauties. And she was actually flatmates with Jacqueline Bisset for a bit. I'm trying to think, the most famous thing you may have seen Fiona in was, have you seen Inner Space?
Yes.
You know the very sexy doctor in Inner Space?
I need to see it again.
The very sexy doctor in Inner Space, who's who warms up Jack Putter when when Martin Short is in the freezing van. She goes, I can warm you up. That was when I first noticed her, shall we say, when I was an 8-year-old, 10-year-old boy or whatever. But she's stuck in my consciousness ever since. Not just because of that scene, but she was married to Art Linson, just as a bit of a trivia point. Excellent actress, lovely woman. But The Untouchables came to mind yet again, not because Kevin Costner was just in JFK, but there is... I know you're saying I'm sort of forcing this sequelization thing, but you're right in the sense that the way they dress Hoover is in that white Panama hat and coat. I did think of Billy Drago in The Untouchables. Maybe because that was just what I wanted to watch, because I think, look, Nixon, much as I love you, you're getting very bloody long, and I don't know what the point of you is. What entertains me about Nixon is, like any shared universe or kind of franchise base, even though it isn't that, is the sense that there's always an alternative version of it. And we talked about Hoskins nearly playing, or rather being offered as the backup as Capone. A lot of the actors who were offered Nixon, it's fascinating. Unless IMDb has it very wrong. I know for a fact Jack Nicholson was offered it and turned it down. I think he would have been fantastic.
Nixon.
Yeah.
I think he would have been better casting.
Yeah, and I think it would have... I think it's a really missed opportunity for him as much as anything, because if we look at this 95, 96, where Before As Good As It Gets, which gives Nicholson a sort of a new lease of life, where he's both serious actor and giving us the Jack that we all know and love. Best of both worlds. But at this stage, we've got Mars Attacks, which flops and doesn't work. I think it's, Blood Diamond? No, not Blood Diamond. Blood and Wine, which is him and Michael Caine, which it works, but it was very obscure. The Crossing Guard.
As well.
Yeah, The Crossing Guard, the Sean Penn movie that doesn't... It's a slow phase for Nicholson, and I just think this would have been...
All right.
Yeah.
Guard's an all right film.
Yeah, no, I like it. I'm talking about homophobia, actually. This was years before we developed our new, more tolerant, understanding, open society. There's a scene that stands out to me in The Crossing Guard where Jack Nicholson is in a jewellery store. And, to be fair, this is a trope of very much the 90s anyway, where we were in transition and moving towards better understanding and acceptance of sexuality, but at the same time still using it as a device, i.e. our leading man is a sensitive guy who can still stand up for gays. But there's a scene where someone comes into a jewellery store and abuses a gay man or something, and Nicholson kind of stands up to them, and I really liked that. But at the time, it was a bit... His career wasn't stalling. He was still getting big paychecks. He was still making headlines. But I just think this would have been a very interesting role. Warren Beatty, who's Nicholson's best buddy, also turned it down and was involved actively in some of the development, insofar as I think he read with Stone.
Warren Beatty was, of all of the names that I saw, because I did see all the names suggested for this.
Yeah.
Warren Beatty would have been the one I wanted.
Yeah.
I don't know why, but Warren Beatty would have been the one I wanted.
Right. Now, Powers Booth is in the movie, and he's played Nixon, hasn't he, separately?
Yeah, yes. The problem with Powers Booth is, again, he plays right into the stereotype of him as a shifty bastard.
Yeah.
Powers Booth never convinces me he's anything other than evil in everything he
does. I know, I love that about him. And who else? They said, did they say Tom Hanks and John Malkovich?
Can't see Tom Hanks in the role.
I can't either.
John Malkovich to me is too one-dimensional. He's another one that's just like evil.
Yeah. Lane Smith would have been good. I mean, obviously not big enough a name at the time to carry it, but he did play Nixon, I
No,
think.
when Lane Smith would have been great. But I look at it and I just go, there's something about Warren Beatty that he can look for such a smooth guy. You know, got put it about with so many women. He can actually play unsettled in front of a camera really well. And if he'd be willing to like get the hair done to look the same as Nixon and all the rest of it, then I can picture him in the role in a way I can't picture anyone else.
He turned down
He's one of
so
those
many things. So many things Warren Beatty turned down.
Inspired, yeah, well, he was notoriously slow to make decisions as well.
Kill Bill he turned down, didn't he?
Get to the point. He was supposed to be Bill in that.
Yeah, turned that down.
I'd have been happier. I'd have been happier with that too. I think he's got kind of a bit more humanity to him than David Carradine did as a screen presence.
Yeah, and also more menace, ironically enough.
And that would have been more interesting to me. I've actually found David Carradine a bit one-dimensional.
Yeah, we should do an entire podcast actually on Beatty because he's a very political filmmaker, and you know his stuff is political.
Oh no, and the Parallax View. The Parallax View is still on Netflix.
But Barry Norman did call him out on it once. Barry Norman, the late British film critic, he did one of these.
Even doing a fucking interview with him was a nightmare, apparently.
Yeah, but it was back in the day. I hate that phrase, but I'm using it anyway. Back in the day when you were allowed to do these sort of more indulgent, more kind of in-depth interviews where it wasn't just, I've got a film to promote, you've got your 5 minutes, let's have a cock joke to show I'm human now, and let's have a laugh, or here's what you've got to see. And Barry Norman kind of went through his whole career. It was to promote Dick Tracy, not a dick joke, no, literally the film Dick Tracy. And at some point he sort of said, yeah, but all my cinema is political. And Barry Norman goes, well, I mean, except Ishtar. Ishtar was a flop. He goes, I thought it was funny and political. No, it was a flop. And he goes, Shampoo is a lot about politics. Yeah. And Barry Norman goes, oh, it isn't, Warren. It's about a very randy hairdresser. You just don't get...
That's all it is.
It's Alan Partridge worthy, but you just don't get that sort of thing anymore.
Shampoo is Warren Beatty at the peak of his powers as like a fucking cocksmith.
Yeah, and there's a line in it which goes, now that's what I call fucking. Yeah. So yes, that's what I call fucking is an actual line in Shampoo, the kind they just don't make anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not something I'm desperate to try myself.
What, fucking or?
It's like saucy banter of that time. I recorded a podcast last night where I did talk a little bit about my saucy banter, but I don't think I'd be trying that line.
Well, you consider how, there are ways of doing it, Dave, and there are ways of not doing it. So, for example, earlier on, I took the liberty of mentioning one of the people that we podcasted with and my daydream erotic fantasy of perhaps recreating a scene from film. That girl is, of course, a lady, and I'm a thorough gentleman. It's never going to happen, but there's nothing wrong with it, provided that one isn't disrespectful by it. So there's nothing wrong with trying to recreate a scene from Shampoo, provided that all of the participants are consenting and realise that it is part of a cinematic tribute rather than actually incriminating.
He doesn't work much now, does he?
Who?
I mean, I know he's getting old now, but...
Well, he is 80, to be fair.
Yes, but this has been the case for years. I mean, his filmography has got... Let me count a minute. This is just films, not TV. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24. Under his filmography, not including tips, there's been 24 credits since 1961.
Okay.
He's not a busy guy. Bonnie and Clyde, he did nothing for 3 years afterwards. McCabe and Mrs. Miller, it was 3 years until the Parallax View. After he did 2 the same year as Shampoo, and then nothing till Heaven Can Wait 3 years later. Then a 3-year gap to Reds. Then a 6-year gap to Ishtar. Then a 3-year gap to Dick Tracy. And so it goes on. Then another 3-year gap, 4-year, 3-year, 7-year, 8-year. This is a guy who, this is why he ends up not doing things. He just seems to debate it for so long, they eventually go find someone else. But it's kind of a shame to me, just only that. How can you say it's been a shame on the one hand when his career has got Bonnie and Clyde, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, the Parallax View, Reds, I suppose, things like that in there that are really terrific. But I do look at Warren Beatty and think, God, he could have achieved so much more.
Yeah. But then I guess that's the same with a lot of great, producers and directors. They're not necessarily
But yeah,
prolific.
I would have loved. I would have loved to have seen him as Nixon, even over and above the other names you've mentioned.
No, sure.
And
Totally.
it's not because I think he's the best actor of the lot. I think he's a left field choice, but I actually think he's the best fit.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of other notable things in Nixon. I mean, David Hyde Pierce from Frasier has a good role.
Frasier.
Yeah. And there's another Kevin Costner No Way Out thing in the sense that Hyde Pierce's role in Nixon, for some reason, kept reminding me of, in No Way Out, Gene Hackman's aide, who is played by a guy called... He's in Armageddon and he's in stuff. He pops up in places. He's in The Client. He plays quite similar characters most of the time. Damn it.
Okay.
I'll put it in the show notes. But yeah, there was something very No Way Out about the idea of a character who nominally is of great service to the president or whoever, but is actually a little bit duplicitous. Actually, quite a lot duplicitous.
A little bit toxic.
Yeah, and once again, without being homophobic or whatever, if we look at No Way Out, okay, that's not an Oliver Stone film, but we've noted the parallels for whatever reason, which is just coincidental. The character who is in that kind of conciliary role is, I think, deliberately played a little bit camp or a little bit slightly hinting at sort of the gayness. And David Hyde Pierce, of course, in Nixon, plays a character who I don't think they talk about his sexuality, but Hyde Pierce tends to play slightly gay guys, or effete, or slightly more kind of
Fate is the probably word.
Yeah.
No Way Out's a Ronald Donaldson film. Looking through his filmography, it's quite a mix of quality and not such quality.
Yeah.
The film that really stands out in that list as absolutely terrific is 13 Days.
Which, once again, features JFK and who? Costner, isn't it?
Costner.
Yeah. So he
As
keeps
well
coming.
as
Bruce Greenwood,
Bruce Greenwood, that's it.
who is in Star Trek as Captain Pike, isn't he?
Yeah, I wanted him as the main captain through the whole fucking series, to be honest.
Yeah. And he also plays a president in National Treasure 2.
I'm getting old, so I want an older man as captain, man. It's just the way I am.
But an older man would be the captain, wouldn't he? Because he's the captain. I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, in the sense that I don't want a 20-something captaining a nuclear submarine, frankly.
Particularly as there's countries you can go to in this world that, like, you show the soles of your feet and it's like a grave offence. Or if you finish your meal, they think you haven't had enough and stuff like that. There are so many little diplomatic faux pas you could fall into. And so it takes a lot of experience and knowledge and study to become, say, a diplomat. Now multiply that by an infinite amount. To go, the promoting fucking Kirk from the Academy was mental.
Why did they do that? Is that just because it's a franchise staple?
No, it was because it's quite interesting. It's because it was written by imbeciles.
Who are these imbeciles?
Of course, Ian Kurtzman.
Well, they're not writing the next one, are they? So
I kind of like that film actually, but I mean
it's a charming film for all the wrong reasons. Plot and character are not why that film is charming. It's basically JJ's warm-up piece for Star Wars. As Mr. Plinkett pointed out at the time, it goes, hell, J.J. Abrams should have directed these prequels, and George Lucas should have directed people to their seats on the theater. But another Star Wars connection, I think it's a really great score for Nixon from John Williams again. It's not one you can sing in the shower. It's not Indiana Jones or Star Wars, but it's slightly... It's more refined than the work on JFK, because, as I say, JFK stuff is quite brutal. Deliberately, it's da-da-da-da, whereas the one for Nixon is a little bit more patriotic and forgiving. I think it's quite balanced on the whole. It gets us away from the idea of Nixon, the bad guy. It doesn't sag too much into Watergate. Watergate is touched on, but it remembers that Watergate is an event in itself. I think it's overambitious. I think it wants to do too many things, and a house divided cannot rule, and consequently Nixon is a bit of a mess. Having said that, in the same way as you pointed out, Dave, so well, that you can take out some very good bits of JFK and just watch those, I think in exactly the same way. If you rent Nixon for a couple of quid on Amazon, you can almost fast forward the bits you don't like or fall asleep in those, and you can wake up or whatever for the bits that are amazing, because there are bits of amazing in it. So I'm not going to slag it off completely, but it's not something I'd necessarily recommend. You can live without seeing it, but equally, if you have to watch it.
It took me this long to see it, and
Yeah.
I'm glad I saw it.
Yeah.
I got through it without difficulty. For all its length, I was never notably bored, even though when I thought about it afterwards, I was like, that is literally an hour too long. But I don't think I'll ever watch it again. And unless somebody I'm with wants to see it, then I'll happily sit through it. But I don't think it's a film I happily need to revisit.
Yeah, no, totally. Well, on that note then, we move on to W, yeah?
Yeah, W was a bit of a surprise to me, in that, all right, it has none of the style or elan of the sort of JFK film, but then neither does The Man in some respects. But I saw this film when it was released. I saw it theatrically. Yeah, American presidency film. Yeah, that would draw me in. It's very much what I like. It was, stuff like Primary Colours I always loved. So yeah, it was great. But it just seems so premature. I found out a few months from the end of W's presidency that Oliver Stone was making a film on him, and I thought, okay, well, he's getting it prepped and ready for when he leaves office, and then he'll go into overdrive, but have some of it ready. And then I realised he was going to release it before W left office, so it came out in, like, I'm guessing, but something like November or something like that, maybe even a bit earlier. So the film lacks historical context. It lacks a clear message of what it wants to say. It's almost like Oliver Stone just wants to be first. That he obviously thinks there's going to be like a George W. Bush film, and he wants to be the one to make it, so I best make it now. So consequently, the film is really unfocused in terms of what's it trying to tell us. I'm going to say one more negative thing, and then I'm going to say something positive. The other negative thing is this film has been really hurt by one thing, Donald Trump, because the historical fucking buffoonery of the man has been now thrown into the shade. And by comparison, George W. Bush looks like a fucking elder statesman. So his presidency is no longer a what the fuck were we thinking that it once was.
Yeah.
He takes his place with the sort of pantheon of presidents. I'm not saying good or bad, but I'm saying he's just another president now. I don't mean any offence there to somebody who lost relatives in Iraq and stuff like that. I know he's done things that were
God, look, we know the thing about you, Dave, is that you don't. That's not a place you ever go. I think in your sensitivity is, I think by now kind of implicit and pervasive. But I think you are quite upfront about the fact that your default setting, if you like, and this is not to say that you can't talk to in an intelligent or understanding manner a right winger or an economic conservative, but your setting of choice, if you like, is to be left wing, not in the loony left sense, but in just the sense of compassionate third way decency that I think our generation were brought up to appreciate anyway. So George Bush, of course, came as a bit of a shock to all of us.
He did, but and of course, it did come off as professional fucking idiocy at the time, because he did get up and say some really odd things. So there is a strain of dyslexia in that family that lends itself to like malapropisms,
sure,
effectively. But is our children learning was a doozy. But that said, you do wonder why that film at that time, when before the film was even came out, the world's economy tanked. There still wasn't a settled view on his presidency and who was in charge, and also during his presidency there was a lot of Dick Cheney's the real president, and the film doesn't even really have a view on that. It has a lovely performance from Richard Dreyfuss as Dick Cheney, and whilst Dick Cheney certainly has his ear, the W in this film knows his own mind. But let's start being a bit more positive here. When I first went to see it, I came out just, what was that all about? And it does have one of the worst performances I've ever seen in any film, and I'll come on to it in a moment. But Josh Brolin is brilliant in it. Just little things like he gets George Bush's walk. Now, most of you probably it hasn't even occurred to you George Bush has a particular walk. because nothing about it really stands up. But watch any footage of George Bush walking anywhere, then watch Josh Brolin doing it. He inhabits the man terrifically, and he also all politicians. I mean, I think of Tony Blair when I think about this. For all Tony Blair's charm, we saw the professional politician, and there would have been a time where he was a bit louder and more leery. And the same was certainly true of George Bush. By the time we knew George Bush, he was a born-again Christian. He didn't drink because he'd had problems with alcohol. And he was famous for going to bed really early. He could have bed at like 8:30 and things like that. Because he took the job seriously. Whether he was good, bad, or indifferent as a president, he took that duty very, very seriously. So what the film captured, and Josh Brolin is perfect casting for this sort of thing, is that we get a look at the sort of leerier younger man that resided within George W. Bush. You know, for years, George Bush, you know, there were rumours that he got to certain schools under people's patronage. I hate calling them schools, universities, but I don't know why I just did. But then you've got him sort of taking on a football team, or was it a baseball team? I think it's a baseball team, and not making a wild success of it. And just floating around without much purpose and drinking too much. And the film covers all of that without ever really being too much of a caricature. We see him as a bit of an asshole, and we do see him drinking rather a lot. But at the same time, he's still very, very charming when he meets Elizabeth Banks. That's a lovely scene when they meet, actually. And we do see this guy is not a pantomime fool. James Cromwell is perfect casting as the elder George Bush as well. I think what I'm coming around to say here is I had a really good time with this.
It's fun, isn't it? I think it manages to be both substantial and light. You can watch this as a comedy. It's not over long. It is
kind of comedic, and his score plays fairly comedic as well.
That's right, and
it's not over long as well. Yeah, it's a couple of hours.
Yeah,
which is short for Oliver Stone.
And
I have to say, for unintentional comedy, I'm not sure anyone has given a worse performance in a big budget film than Tandy Newton as Condoleezza Rice. She is absolutely horrendous in this.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, it's quite a one-note character in real life as well. I never warmed to Condoleezza Rice because she always, she was a robot, wasn't she?
Yeah, I agree. But the thing is,
what can you do with the character? What can you do with it?
Well, it's a bit like Tandy Newton has said to Oliver, prepping for this film, can you send me some videos of Condi doing her bit, right? And he's gone, well, sorry, there aren't any. And she goes, well, what does she sound like then? Vaguely Katharine Hepburn. Right, got it.
Yeah.
It's Condoleezza Rice by way of parody of Katharine Hepburn with a bit of Scarlett O'Hara thrown in. It's really, really bad. And next to her, you've got Jeffrey Wright doing a really restrained, thoughtful, concerned Colin Powell. So it stands out like a sore thumb. It's awful.
Yeah.
Because she's surrounded by quality. I mean, Josh Brolin is great in this. And, we saw John Travolta a few years before this play a loose sort of version. Well, it's not even loose. It's
Clinton. It's Bill Clinton. Everybody knows it's Bill Clinton. Let's call it a spade a spade.
Albeit it's Governor Jack Stanton.
Yeah.
And a bit like with Dennis Quaid playing the same character, he only captured one facet of him. I said in a previous show, it's a bit like Will Smith playing Ali.
Yeah.
That the mode of Ali he caught was perfect from Ali in that mood doing that voice, but there was more to him than that. Brolin captured so much more, and he managed to capture it through different stages of his life, but also different stages of his sobriety and different attitudes. And again, we saw the serious politician who was a bit of a jerk in some ways. He came off that way, but he did take the job extremely seriously. And the film shows you that there's actually quite a charming guy under it all.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. The subtlety, because it's not an impression; it is a performance. But having said that, this is why Josh Brolin is so good. We talked about Tommy Lee Jones earlier on. Men in Black 3, which is sort of a course correction from the missed opportunity that was Men in Black 2, features Josh Brolin.
It's Josh Brolin as
a,
a
a,
young
a young Tommy Lee Jones. Now, he's not... Because I think Tommy Lee Jones, a bit like Jack Nicholson, is one of those big hitter actors where you can do an impression by simply doing the drawl. That's right, that thing. And quoting The Fugitive and stuff like that, which everybody down the pub can do. I want a detailed search for your own house, all that. What Josh Brolin manages to do in Men in Black 3 is to capture what would have been a younger Tommy Lee Jones, but also a younger Agent K. And the humour of the character, and a slightly softer, slightly more romantic, slightly less world-weary, but at the same time the essence of the character. One scene that comes to mind, which is where Will Smith doing, for a change, what we'd like Will Smith to do, which is that kind of spoofing, making it up on the spot thing. Yeah, I'm here to see my girlfriend. Okay, what's your girlfriend's name? And he goes, she's Sterren. And you think that Brolin's going to say that's bullshit, but he goes, okay, well, let's go see Sterren. And it's the comedic timing of it. It's the capturing of Tommy Lee Jones, but also giving it his own spin on it, without doing a flat-out impression.
Effectively, the humorless. Yeah, I mean, it reminds me of Leonard Nimoy playing a Vulcan, and no one else can do it.
Yeah.
That Leonard Nimoy manages to play Vulcan, an emotionless character, as kind of a bit sardonic and quite funny.
Yes.
You see anyone else try and play a Vulcan, and they play it as robots, like having no emotion or control of your emotions means putting no intonation in your voice whatsoever.
And that's not it.
So I've seen some really flat shit fucking Vulcans over the years. And Josh Brolin's got that. He can play essentially unfunny characters really, really funny.
Yeah.
And I like this film. I like this film quite a bit. It lacks... I don't know why it exists. I don't know what it's trying to show us, what it's trying to tell us.
Maybe it doesn't have to.
That guy, there's a bit, once he's in the White House, where he walks somewhere, and I just watched him, and I thought, if I squint, that's George W. Bush walking.
Yeah. This
guy's better than I thought.
Well, he captures, I think, all of the things that you've talked about with Bush, and you've been very balanced, incidentally, in so doing, despite your fears to the contrary. We take a character who is flawed, who was a bit of, I think the British phrase that we would use is, do you know the phrase wide boy? Have you ever heard that? A wide boy? A bit of a wide boy, a bit of a lad. Not a bad guy, but not someone who you would anticipate as being an intellectual or destined necessarily for a sort of a philosophical worldview. But on the other hand, not despite that, but maybe because of that, parentage and lineage aside, if we look at America at its core, and this is in no way, in the same way as you're concerned about being respectful to people, I'm trying to qualify this. America at its heart is both built on refined philosophy, your Locke's and Washington's and the Constitution and all of the ideals that are there, but also on, and we hinted at this last time, a gold rush, a Wild West sense of conquest, action, to some extent over words, and a sense of enterprise. And George W. Is very much, I think, without being disrespectful either to him or to America, a personification of the latter. And it is perfectly fair to say that there is a voter base out there that was interested in that. Now, if we look at his life story, we get, and this is once again where Brolin, and to his credit, indeed Stone, capture this so well, an honesty, about the fact that he was a bit off the rails because he didn't have a purpose that necessarily harnessed all of that.
And he wasn't Jen.
Yeah, he had a legacy. He had a legacy to live up to.
The difficult second album of the Bush children.
Yeah, precisely. He had a family legacy to live up to. But at the same time, some gifts, insofar as, for all of the hot-headedness and, the reform drinking, at its core, a desire to please that legacy and to be respectful to it, of the country and the family, but needed the right role for it. Now, if we fast forward, and once again, the film does this very well, without being overlong or too long-winded, you do see that painful realization that he's not cut out for certain things and that it's looking like he's in danger of becoming a drifter. But equally, as history and philosophy show us, cometh the man, cometh the hour. And ultimately, the reason he has done better than the beloved, sainted Jeb, a similar reason, incidentally, as to why Trump was able to trump Jeb in the debates recently.
There's only one answer to this. And I think
charisma.
you're getting close to it. Go on.
Charisma and charm. And when Al Gore...
He can talk to... It's the ability to talk to quote-unquote ordinary people.
Precisely. Now, there are...
Jeb doesn't have that.
He doesn't have it.
Jeb looks like the latest of a dynasty. George W. Bush never did.
Yeah. And the other thing is, charisma in politics, as we established with Nixon and JFK, is important. And it does win votes. And when I say charisma, I mean that kind of... I'm not talking just about... I mean, I mentioned Trump, leaving him out of it for a second. Likability and kind of honesty, even about one's limitations. Now, I know there are all sorts of question marks about whether or not Bush legitimately defeated Al Gore, and those are for history to judge. However, if we look at 2004, the 2004 election, which is post-invasion of Iraq, post-9/11, George Bush wins that fair and square. And he doesn't win it just because the country is at war and gravitates to the patriotism. It's because of that kind of charismatic honesty. One episode that kind of stood out to me, well, there are two. One where I think he was being questioned, they sort of said, who's the president of Pakistan? I know that he's...
That was the first election.
Oh, that's the first one. Okay, well, in the second... Well, we'll go to that first election for a second, but it's the same thing. Sort of, they go, who's the president of Pakistan? I know he's he's general. And they say, what's his name? General. And they go, do you know his name? He goes, no, do you? I just love it. But then in the second election, they say, okay, look, President Bush, you've described your opponent in this election, John Kerry, as flip-flop.
John Kerry.
Yeah, John Kerry, who is ostensibly, he's a Vietnam veteran, he's an intellectual, he's a nice guy, fan man, married to Heinz, money, etc. Seems to have everything going for him.
He's kind of the Democrat McCain.
Precisely, exactly. Should tick all the boxes. But the interviewer says, you and your team have been a bit unkind to Senator Kerry, or Mr. Kerry, whatever, and you've called him flip-flop. Why do you call him flip-flop? And Bush just positively goes, well, we call him flip-flop because, well, he changes his mind a lot. And then he pauses. He goes, and we say that he changes his mind a lot because he changes his mind a lot. I just thought, you've won this election already. And of course, I was right. I wish I'd put money on it. Yeah. On the other hand, if we look at...
He was helped by the fact that John Kerry had zero charisma.
There is that. But also, if we look at it at a more profound level, and you nailed this immediately in a way that so many people haven't. For all of the mistakes that Bush made, and they were mistakes, there's just no getting away from it, and they were precipitous decisions taken with 1,000 influences from various power blocks, to which one would have expected Oliver Stone to play into in a quasi-conspiracy thriller way. You know, this sort of the right-wing establishment, evangelicals, and so on, all the people who'd helped bring him to power or, you know, a sense of responsibility. There was that earnest desire to please America, to please the family, and to be seen to be doing something decent. And that is something that, if we're distinguishing him from Trump, that's the distinction. That is why I think people have been a bit kinder to Bush recently. And I think that process actually began the moment that he left. If you look, for example, at his relations with Obama, he's always been very respectful to Obama. I think they're not bosom buddies or anything, but, you know.
He was a grown-up. He left office. He did involve McCain, and when the crash happened, he involved them properly. He's got quite a friendship with Obama's wife that he makes fun about.
Yeah.
When he goes, he's like, she doesn't look at him like that, and it's just humour.
Yeah.
You know, he's a good-natured guy, and again, I don't want to make light of anything.
Yeah.
You can only judge what's put in front of you, and he's far from a comedy villain. He wasn't necessarily the greatest president.
No. And Iraq,
He did try to cast himself as a wartime president. And unfortunately, if you perpetuate being a wartime president by perpetuating war.
Yes.
You know, and I do think there's too much of a hawkish side to him. But the film, A W, reminds you that there was a man under that. There was a man before the politician, just as there was with Blair and every other politician that was out there, except Gordon Brown. I think he was born in a lounge suit.
Oh yeah, sure.
And I think Josh Brolin does a terrific job. And if there's one positive to do in the film before he's out of office, Oliver Stone seemed to forget the need to say anything important and just focused on making a reasonably entertaining couple of hours, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. Now there's a Bond connection. There's a Bond connection, isn't there? Because Josh's dad, James, was lined up.
James Brolin was lined up around the time of Octopussy.
And I've seen the screen test. It's very good.
I've seen the screen test. He doesn't even change his accent. Again, anytime you think Cubby Broccoli was like absolutely unimpeachable quality as a Bond producer, he did make some odd decisions. James Brolin was one of them. The other thing is, I might be misremembering this, but wasn't James Brolin effectively a George W. Bush analog as President Bartlett's opposition in Bartlett's second election?
Yeah, I think so.
Third season or fourth season, I'm sure they got a slightly clueless-looking Southern governor as a very thin George W. Bush.
I'll have to check it out.
James Brolin.
Check it out for show notes.
Yeah.
And Josh, of course, there's a Batman connection because Josh was in the running before Affleck, I think, or alongside Affleck to be the Batman v Superman Batman. And of course, I think Jeffrey Dean Morgan, who plays Thomas Wayne, and if they do go... What?
I looked up one thing. I looked up one thing tonight when when I was talking about his walk.
Yeah.
As Bush, it actually changed the way I see James Brolin, Josh Brolin. Sorry,
yep.
I always thought of him as a big, substantially sized guy.
Yes.
Yeah, he was governor. I looked it up. James Brolin was Governor Robert Ritchie in The West Wing.
And Josh is now, of course, a huge star because he's going to be. We were talking about Tommy Lee Jones. In fact, Tommy Lee Jones built his kind of stardom on the back of playing, villain of the week.
Just to quickly finish the point on Batman. My reservation would be he's 5'9.5". I think he's a little bit too small.
And yet, as Thanos and Cable, back to back, which is a double whammy.
He's animated as Thanos. Can't go on when he looks big there. That's not him, is it?
Okay, but Cable, he's ripped. Yeah?
Yeah, okay.
Have you seen him as Cable? Have you seen the screenshots?
No, I'll have a look. Hang on a minute.
Loads of people thought Pierce Brosnan was going to be Cable for a second, just because he took a photo with Hugh Jackman and
which just would have been fucking mental.
And Ryan Reynolds. Having said that, age-wise, it would have made sense because Cable's supposed to be a kind of a mentor turned bad or something from the future. So
I'm looking at him now, but he is even as Cable. I'm looking at it here. And he's a wiry, smaller kind of ripped. I mean, I'm looking at this, and the first thing that springs to mind is actually the Punisher. He would have been pretty good as a Punisher.
He's a good actor.
But yeah,
he's a big star. I think he'll be a huge star as well. How old is he now? Is he 40?
49.
He's nearly 50.
49, yeah.
Blimey.
Yeah, Josh Brolin's an older actor, yeah.
Wow. I did not know that. Well, you learn something new every day. So, on the whole, do we recommend W? Do we like it?
Yes.
Fabulous.
Recommend it.
Unlike the next one, Take Us Into Snowden. Now, Edward Snowden, we know you're listening to us. We know you listen to everyone. This is nothing personal against you or against, your people, your network of, dissenters and spies. Don't hack us. You won't find anything interesting. Actually, you might. But anyway. Snowden, what do we think?
The problem is with Snowden, you are making a film about interesting acts performed by a relatively uninteresting man, and that's a problem as a film.
He's not sexy, is he?
He's kind of a Grace like analyst type character.
Yes.
A bookish type. That's not a leading man, and I'm pretty convinced now Joseph Gordon-Levitt isn't a leading man either. I like Joseph Gordon-Levitt, by the way.
When did you first so if we go to the personnel before we go into the sort of the substance of the ideas of the film, Levitt is an interesting one insofar as it certainly took me a long time to, because as you know, I'm trying to reform this side of myself, but when I see an actor suddenly promoted and loved on the back of a particular role or something, or they're casting
people to hit it big at the age of 89 just before death.
Yes, pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, I suppose it was just that I saw Joseph Gordon-Levitt as the kid from Third Rock from the Sun, and it took me.
Watched, so I didn't have that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I wasn't a huge fan of it or anything, but I saw him as this basically 12-year-old kid, and it took me a long time to accept that he'd grown up and that he was fancied by women everywhere for some reason. I mean, he's handsome, I suppose. He's kind of pretty. He's likable. But the second thing was that he had become a character actor. And I think in that same ways, it took me a while to accept that, yeah, Cumberbatch and certain others are loved. When I saw him cast as basically a young analog Bruce Willis in Looper, I said, piss off. There is no way that kid...
Yeah, but the thing is, I still say piss off to that. I think that was a miscast.
Interesting. Okay, good. Good. Very good on that. Having said
The
that,
thing is, I like the film, and I do rate Ryan Johnson quite a bit, but like one as a younger version of the other doesn't work for me.
no.
You needed someone far more blue collar than Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Yeah. So the film that really won me over to him, the film where I thought, yeah, I like you, it's 500 Days of Summer, because I think what that film manages to do so brilliantly is to talk about the everyman, the nowadays man, in romantic film. It talks about, if you like, the structure and the pattern of film in the film, while still delivering a movie. About the frustrations of masculinity. It's a masculine character who has limitations, but he talks about those limitations. So he's not a complete Wally of the Friends era where they're sort of completely emasculated. There's a scene where he awkwardly punches someone in a bar. He genuinely wants to be this old school kind of macho character. But the film's narrative with Zooey Deschanel is she's sort of saying, look, I don't want you to have to prove yourself like that. It's disgusting. It's not funny. It's not endearing. That doesn't mean I don't want a man who can't do that. I just don't want a man who thinks that he has to...
You shouldn't be driven to need to be doing that.
Precisely. And I just thought he acted that so well. The hurt at it, the naivety, but also the genuine desire to have that kind of masculine drive. I thought, yes, you're a big star. I didn't like the film he did about the sex addict who has a masturbation problem. The what?
Don John.
Yeah.
John.
And he directed that, didn't he? But, each to their own. I do think he's a force for good, particularly on Twitter. I think he promotes a lot of kind of creative art and charity and music and so on. And I think he's got a lot of very good work in him. I'm quite pleased they didn't try and do a spin-off Batman franchise with him, because I don't think that would have necessarily worked.
It would totally not have worked. He was all wrong for it. He worked. He worked only by degree of distance from Christian Bale and that story.
Yeah. Although, ironically enough, we come back to it. Christian Bale is now playing Dick Cheney, so it's all come full circle.
Yeah.
Be interesting.
Do
But
you think he picks his roles based on how hungry he is?
I want to eat. Yeah. No.
I want to eat for a few months.
No. Shut the fuck up, Dave. You're not professional. Yeah. No. So I do like.
Professionally, man. What we're doing there is him on the set of.
Yes, that's me. I do, just for listeners' interest, not that you are interested in me, but I do listen sometimes to the Christian Bale rant just when I need cheering up. It's a very bizarre thing. One of my final memories of... It is funny, because it's sort of, just when he appears to be calming down, he starts up again. Like someone, Christian, why don't we just take a minute? And you think, yeah, it's when she goes, No, let's not take a minute. Let's go again. And let's not have you fucking and bullshitting around in the background. And one of my, memories of, final memories of my late grandfather was I went into his hospital. And I for whatever reason, I had the Christian Bale rant as an MP3 on my phone. I think some ex-girlfriend pointed out the reason you like listening to that, James, is that's because that's what you'd like to do, isn't it? You'd love to just have a rant at people. I don't know where she got that from, but anyway. And I played it for my grandfather. He loved it. He said, "Oh, play that again. He sounds like a psychopath. Maybe a psychopath on drugs, but a great actor. I like it. Play it again." So there are sentimental reasons for it. But aside from that, Joseph Gordon-Levitt at that time, I'd seen him as well, having seen him in 500 Days of Summer, suddenly seen him in Dark Knight Rises, and I didn't want him as the next Batman, but I thought he managed to sell the character of Robin without playing Robin, which is another achievement. That's a really subtle piece of acting in the Dark Knight Rises that Levitt pulls off. So I've never seen bad work from this guy.
He's fine. I just don't think he's a leading man. That's not.
He's good in support.
That's not an insult.
No. He needs a strong person opposite him.
Someone alongside him on the screen.
Be it Zooey Deschanel or Christian Bale.
It's just simply a chemistry and a dynamics thing.
On the other hand, you've also pointed out, Dave, once again, very brilliantly at the beginning, that Edward Snowden himself does not invite, necessarily, a kind of a charismatic, dynamic leading man, which is usually what Hollywood would have gone to. This would probably be Tom Cruise 20 years ago. And you've also pointed out that Snowden owes a great deal to the firm. Can you point that out?
The point there's a sequence in The Firm where Tom Cruise realises the house is bugged. And they're being watched because effectively they're mob lawyers.
Yeah.
So very early in the film, he's tempted into sleeping with someone else, which doesn't ring true in the film. It's painted as having this wonderful, marriage with what's she called, Jean Tripplehorn, and yet he just randomly fucks some woman on the beach, and they can take some photos of it. So that's weird. But he realizes it's bugged, so he goes into his house, and of course he can't be heard to say all this stuff. So he turns like the music up to absolute maximum, and then whispers in her ear. And she goes to run, and he catches up with her and just says, "We've got to be normal." The analog for that scene in this is he takes her out into the garden in Hawaii, I think, by that point of the film, sits her down, and very calmly tells her that when we go back in there, we've got to be normal. It's the same scene, effectively.
And what about the politics of this? I mean, I always have difficulty with it because the media, once again, in their usual kind of cut and paste soundbite world, tend to paint Snowden, I think, a little bit unfairly, as being identical to Assange, or as I call him, Assange, or whatever his name is. I don't know.
I think Assange is a fucking ludicrous figure.
But Snowden isn't.
No, Snowden isn't.
So why are they painted together? They're not the same. I don't get it. Assange is on a mission to leak information. Snowden was simply pointing out forensically, look, yes, we have a duty to listen on suspected terrorists. We do not have a duty to listen on everybody on the off chance that one of you might be a terrorist.
The film paints him as extremely disturbed with the whole webcam thing. I don't know if this is literally what happened or just the way the film paints it to make the point, because it's a webcam from some lady's laptop, young lady, where she's forgotten to shut the lid, so the camera is still pointing directly out, and they can switch it on and access it without any lights and even the PC being on. And she's a Muslim, so she's wearing like a burqa or something like that, and has to take all that off, and she's starting to get a bit scantily clad, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt is like, we shouldn't really be watching this.
Yeah.
Unlike the Oliver Stone I think I know, at least he didn't paint the other guy as being turned on by it or anything.
It's too easy to do that, too easy to go there.
It's too easy to do that, yeah, but it's also very... There is a bit of me that thinks films like this, Oliver Stone's probably sat masturbating on set all day. I just think this is so much in his wheelhouse to go, look how corrupt our government is. And,
yes,
you know, there's a soundbite in the film from Obama saying, well, you look at it in its broad strokes and it looks terrible, but if you look at the detail, actually I think it's proportionate. Now, he would say that, wouldn't he? And the fact that he said that doesn't make it right. But the very fact you hear him say that is strange to go, well, what's the other angle then? What's the opposite points to any of this?
Yeah.
I tend to be very sympathetic to a Snowden, and I'm very sympathetic to them because we've had this over a number of years yet, and I find that I hate even using this term because this is kind of juvenile as well, but the establishment's response is, I think, always really fucking juvenile, because suddenly it always turns out they were paedophiles or cross-dressers or something.
Of course.
Which, of course, they're not. It's just fucking, well, that would be too much of a coincidence. David Shaler leaked, was an MI5 agent who leaked.
Can I just pause you there for 1 second? Because I've got a Shaler story which you're going to love.
Okay.
Oxford Union, 2001. He came to give a talk at the Oxford Union. And I wasn't hugely active in the Oxford Union, but I went when there was a story that would interest me or something. I remember at the time a lot of people saying, James, why don't you do more politics at the Oxford Union, or why don't you go to more debates? Well, the long and the short of it was, I got the feeling very quickly that the Oxford Union is not the university. And all the people who said, oh, you'll be very successful if you go, I was kind of thinking, well, I won't necessarily, because it takes up a lot of time. There's a lot of political games to play. And at the time, Blair was the guy in power, not Haig. Haig was the guy who'd been the president of the Oxford Union. Blair was the guy who played his guitar in his room and managed to scrape a first or 2-1 or whatever it was. So the parallels were there. But I went to the David Shaler talk, and, it was pretty innocuous stuff. There was nothing world-breaking or particularly confidential that I felt he was leaking. In fact, to be honest, I found it kind of boring. What I did find very interesting, however, was the team who put the thing together. I had a lovely friend who was on the team who invited him, I think, who's now a very high-flying barrister, a lovely fellow called Charlie. And I went up to the gallery afterwards, where there was after the do champagne or whatever. And there was this beautiful French blonde vision who appeared to be on her own. And, I was in that phase where I thought I was a bit James Bondy. When I say that, I don't mean in the sense of sort of swinging out of buildings or trying to save the world, but in the sense of, hello, walks into a building and thinks he can own the room by just being incredibly charming, suave, etc. That sort of delusional nonsense that most 20-somethings at some point, I'm sure, experience. So I went up to this lovely girl, and I think I was sort of monopolising her company, but there was a genuine affinity. She was great fun. We've subsequently, I think, become Facebook friends. Annie McMahon, I think her name is. And she was Shayla's girlfriend. And people were sort of saying to me at the time, saying, James, you've got to be a bit more careful. I was saying, why? And I said, because she's his girlfriend. They're going to think you're some sort of MI5 plant or something. And I said, that's not why I was talking to that girl. And they said, well, why were you? I said, because I fancied her. I was trying to, I didn't care that she was going out with this MI5 guy. I had it in my head that I was so supremely cool, suave, and attractive that I would simply go, hi, James, here's a glass of champagne, and I'm so incredibly sexy and brilliant that I can seduce you away from this overly
I see after last night's podcast I can't even make fun of this now.
overly worthy character. Having said that, that year I did get a quasi offer from the CIA. I mean, I say this, I mean, it's not the myth about the intelligence services is that they're all clandestine. They're not. They recruit quite openly, insofar as obviously, if you're going to be a career intelligence officer or something like a modern equivalent of a real life equivalent of Bond, that is of course top secret. No one will ever know about it.
Be a fucking typist.
Yeah, kind of. Like if you're going to be a Jack Ryan type, however, an analyst who's looking at problems, they recruit quite openly. It's like they've got stalls at fairs and stuff like that. And I ended up having a drink with an American general or something.
It's one of the toilet cubicles, but it's there.
Yeah, it's kind of open, but they did that. They were quite nice to me and quite open. And in retrospect, if I put the two events together, I'd like to flatter myself and think, well, it was obviously because I was so charming and seductive and trying to, seduce Shayla's girlfriend away from him, not because I was on the pay of the intelligence service, but just because I thought I was hot shit. But she has subsequently become not quite as, I won't say subversive because that's the wrong word for Shayla, but not as controversial a figure as Shayla. But what Anne now is an expert on intelligence in a global market, like, the intelligence for hire subculture that's nothing to do with the agencies, like how to protect yourself from the criminal elements that are out there trying to nick your data and stuff like that, which to some extent Snowden is much more a proactive part of. This is the image that I got from the Snowden movie, which is that, to bring it back into movies, I just thought I'd tell that story for nothing because I think it's quite funny and I love reliving it because she was beautiful. But anyway, moving swiftly on, is the idea that he's doing something constructive through a destructive doorway. He doesn't, at no stage, either in what I've read about Snowden or indeed in the Oliver Stone presentation of the movie, do I think that this is some anarchist trying to bring down the so-called establishment. He's forensically saying, guys, what you're doing is unnecessary, illegal. And I think the other point he's making is he's sort of saying it's not actually the most efficient either. Because if you think about it, if you're widening the net so much, in the intervening time, even if you have the algorithms to match that can move as quickly as that, you might actually lose a lead.
If you follow everyone, there's no point in following fucking anyone.
Precisely, you might lose a lead rather than gain one.
The sheer amount of data there is excessive.
So he was troubleshooting for them. He was doing them a massive favour, I think. I don't think he was... That's my point. But I think it is a grey area, because the only way that he could leak it to anybody was to leak it. And the moment you leak something of that nature, well, people have to cover it up, or they have to, counter-attack or whatever it was. And we think of the Obama years as sort of crystal clear and beyond the dark arts of espionage. But ultimately, a president can only go so far. He's a figurehead. I mean, yes, he's in charge, but he can't see everything. I don't know how much of this Obama was aware of, but it did happen on his watch. It's the slightly darker side of the Obama era, I suppose, in the sense that, he was still a president in charge of a country that was still nominally and is still nominally at war on the nebulous thing that is terror, where there are real villains who want to do real harm. We've seen that today, sadly. Thankfully, it was averted, but there was the attempted attack in New York. There are villains out there, but for me, the point Snowden was trying to make was it's not just about the violation of privacy at a philosophical level, though there is that. It's very much about, well, hang on a second, we need to be clear in the mission parameters so that we can get to the right villains, so that we're not wasting time on the wrong ones. Having said that, I think even that is probably could be flipped over and said, well, you're not necessarily going to make things more efficient if you don't use this algorithm or whatever. One of the things I like about movies is that they don't have too much technobabble. They kind of gloss over it, but they make it clear that this is a language that only techno people speak. It does, however, have the problem, Dave, I think, that it's not an action movie and it's not Jason Bourne. And they try to use the imagery of stuff like Bourne and try to edit it and make it interesting with sort of montages. And you can't make computers sexy and fun unless you have an action sequence. And there really isn't any action in it, I don't think. So, would you agree with me on that?
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I thought the film was fine. I thought he was fine. I think... fine is the overwhelming words of all of this. I do think Oliver Stone has a tendency to editorialise at the end of his films, and think he's telling us something profound. So we've got, Edward Snowden by Link Up, telling us exactly what lessons we're to learn from all of this. It was fine. I was a bit Oliver Stoned out by this point. What was nice about watching them in order, all four of these, is I felt I was starting with the strongest one, and that's probably true. JFK is probably the strongest of the four we watched. But I thought it was going to be downhill from then. I thought, well, we got Nixon, that's a substantial historical figure, and I've not seen it. And it was probably the last time Anthony Hopkins was properly motivated as well. So I'll probably enjoy this, and I was disappointed. So I came into the last two, W and Snowden, just going, these aren't going to be great. Because I'd seen W and actually not been that bothered at the time. Probably because we just had 8 years of the real W, and I was glad to see the back of it. So perhaps a light, vaguely comedic take on him at that point wasn't really the right timing. But again, revisiting them, that was almost a renaissance. 3 films in to get W, 3 films in the 4, and really enjoy it. I was Oliver Stoned out by this point. It was okay. Everyone's working very hard in it. Everyone's doing very nicely in it. There's some bizarre casting in it. Like getting what's he called, Tom Wilkinson to play Scottish, but fair enough.
Well, they just have generic British actor thing.
I know, but the other thing is, Shailene Woodley was a miscast as well. She's too much younger than.
Do you think maybe they wanted Jennifer Lawrence? I don't know why I keep thinking of Jennifer Lawrence. I mean, I do think of her quite a lot in many ways, but what I mean is,
I don't know what the budget of this would have been.
That's what I mean.
By the time this film came out, Jennifer Lawrence is like one of the biggest actors of a generation. So
yeah,
probably not. Shailene Woodley is. I've always find this really quite difficult to talk about because I sound like a pig. Because she was cast to play Mary Jane Watson in The Amazing Spider-Man 2.
Yeah.
And the internet immediately erupted with abuse about what a dog she was and how ugly she was.
Oh, charming.
She was fucking awful. But the thing is, there's a kernel of a point there. The kernel of the point being that Mary Jane Watson is meant to be an absolute fucking knockout, and I'm not sure Shailene Woodley is. But she's still got a little bit of puppy fat around her face, which is just her age. That's all that is. At the point where we're talking about that's all that is.
Yeah.
So of course she's still got a vaguely teen look to me. And then you got Joseph Gordon-Levitt, who's well into his 30s, and yes, you do get age gaps in relationships, but they look like half a generation apart. So I think she's a miscast. Although she did capture that slightly bohemian feel I think they were going for with that character. So she's very good. And also, seeing her in Hawaii reminded me of The Descendants, which is where I first saw her. Very good film, The Descendants, with George Clooney.
Yeah.
So...
We should do a Clooney podcast, actually, because he, like Warren Beatty, he's another very political...
We'll talk off air after we finish recording, because I might be up for that as an idea.
Yeah.
We'll decide what's in that. So, yeah, I mean, I don't have a lot more to say about this film. It's the best and worst of Oliver Stone. He stopped grandstanding as badly as once he did.
Yes.
He's learned to cut his films a little bit fucking leaner. Whether that's less clout these days, because he's not as big as once he was.
Yeah.
So perhaps he can't say through a studio. It's going to be 3.5 hours. Is that all right? But the last 2 films have benefited from being a little shorter.
Yeah.
But he doesn't feel as vital as once he did.
Yeah.
As evidenced by the topics perhaps he's picking now.
I mean, he's older. He has less, perhaps, to rile against. He has new formats, like all filmmakers. I mean, he's got documentary, like the Putin interviews and whatnot. We're a long way from Vietnam now, so I think the impetus to talk about the causes and the effects of that, which initially drove him, aren't there. I think he missed the boat on a couple of... We talked about actors who turn things down. There are a couple of things that could have given him a little bit more commercial credibility, which could have bought him the license to make a few more serious movies that he turned down. He was actively involved at one point in developing what became one of the various aborted Superman projects. And he was also heavily involved in the initial development of Mission Impossible 2, the premise to which has only just been leaked. And it's very interesting now because it's now kind of more relevant. He wanted to have Ethan Hunt take on AI, gone rogue. It would have been Ethan Hunt versus an oil rig, where they've installed AI and it goes completely crazy and tries to destroy the world. Now that's now a very modern concern, and that's sort of 20 years previously. And I think he would have done amazing things with Superman. I would have loved to have seen an Oliver Stone Superman movie. In a way that, but then a lot of directors were invited. Shaker Kapoor was also involved there and missed the boat as well. There were a lot of missed Superman movies that would have been very interesting, and they didn't make them, sadly. But there you have it. I think on the whole, he is a filmmaker of interest. I think he does have a certain style. I think he's got messages. I think those messages sometimes cancel themselves out, particularly when you want to play both sides, partly because you don't want to upset people and partly because you do. I think with JFK, he does want to upset people, and he does. I think with Nixon, he doesn't want to upset people. I think with W, he finally finds just a piece of character study and comedy and warmth where you take a controversial figure and you peel away the layers and get a humanity without it being a eulogy or an apology. And I think with
not a eulogy of the guy at all.
No. But I think with Snowden, the difficulty is one of genre, because he's basically trying to play a little bit to the commercial side. They're trying to do a bit of that kind of Bourne techno thriller stuff. There's a bit of the kind of the mentor passing the torch thing. They throw in Nicolas Cage in a cameo. They've got Timothy Olyphant in a role that maybe Bill Paxton would have played 20 years previously as sort of the school bully figure of the CIA, if you like. He's sort of, do you remember Weird Science? Yeah, Bill Paxton. That for some reason, when I saw Olyphant play the character that Olyphant plays in Snowden is not unlike that kind of school bully figure.
No.
He's like the Stifler.
If you listen to Kevin Smith talk, Timothy Olyphant's not unlike that in real life.
I love it. I shouldn't love it, but I kind of find that
he talked about the way he was on Die Hard 4, and the guy sounds a complete fucking idiot.
I love complete fucking idiots, but there you go. What was it?
Right casting.
Yeah.
All the way through all of these, by and large, he's got pretty good casting instincts.
Jolie Richardson crops up in Snowden as well. She's an actress who, once again, we talked about actors who didn't quite make it or something. Jolie is somebody...
She wasn't as big as she could have been.
Yeah, and she's just as good an actress at times as her mother, Vanessa Redgrave. I met Jolie once. I went to see a production of Lady Windermere's Fan, where I also met Jack Davenport afterwards, another actor who I think could have been Bond.
It does seem something of a coincidence to me, James, that you seem to have met every slightly posh MILF.
You might very well think that. I couldn't possibly comment.
Yeah.
Oh, speaking of posh MILFs, just...
You're a fucking fantasist. You're probably called Sydney or something.
Yes, these are all fantasies. However, the Annie Machon story is not fantasy. That's her name. It wasn't McMahon. I don't know where I got McMahon. Annie Machon.
Go on, it doesn't matter.
I've Googled her. I have the images in front of me, and I can justify politically, socially, ecumenically, etc. I can verify she was an impossibly quite hot, beautiful woman. But I was interested in her things she had to say about the intelligence.
I'm not even going to look. I'm not that shallow.
Things she had to say about the intelligence community was the reason I really wanted to talk to her. I was very interested socially and politically in her outcomes, goals, etc. So where do we go with the next podcast, Dave? What are we looking at? What do you want to do? Are we going to do the Gentleman Thief one? Are we going to do Robin Hood and Maverick and the Saint and those guys?
Yes, we are. We are going to do something around that.
And Thomas Crown, maybe.
We haven't worked out yet. I mean, you're looking at Robin Hood, Thomas Crown.
Yeah.
What's the other one?
Maverick, the Saint, maybe.
Definitely Maverick.
Yeah.
We'll work out the details offline. But
fabulous. And the usual plug, please. You're coming up to the 100th episode of Do You Expect Us to Talk? There's a Christmas one coming up.
Actually, we recorded episode 99 last night. We're recording the Christmas commentary, which is Love Actually tomorrow.
Oh, bless.
So over the next 3 weeks, you've got the finish of the Back to the Future series. You've got the Love Actually commentary. You've got, and we have announced what it is, a From Russia with Love commentary for the 100th episode, and then we move on to Quentin Tarantino.
Well, what can I say? It's been emotional. It's been great.
You can say thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good night, folks.
Sweet dreams.